The vast expanse of the Pontic Caspian steppes stretched endlessly under grey skies, its rolling grasslands broken only by meandering rivers and scattered burial mounds that dotted the horizon like ancient sentinels. Here, during the turbulent decades of the 1st century AD, a confederation of nomadic tribes known collectively as the Sarmatians held dominion over territories spanning from the Don River to the Carpathian Mountains. Among these fierce horsemen, one group would emerge to cast a shadow far longer than their numbers might suggest: the Alans, whose name would echo through the corridors of history for nearly a millennium. The Alans did not appear suddenly from the void of prehistory. Rather, they crystallized as a distinct political and cultural entity through a complex process of tribal amalgamation, territorial conquest, and cultural synthesis that characterized steppe politics during the early imperial period. Roman sources from this era, particularly the writings of Pliny the Elder and later Tacitus, begin to distinguish the Alans from their Sarmatian cousins around 35 AD, when their raiding parties first struck across the Caucasus into Armenia and the Roman client kingdoms of the region. Archaeological investigations across the northern Black Sea littoral have revealed the material foundations of Alan emergence through systematic excavation of Kurgan burial complexes dating to this period. These earthen mounds, some reaching heights of 15 metres and containing multiple burial chambers, provide tangible evidence of a society undergoing rapid stratification and cultural consolidation. The Novocherkassk treasure, discovered in 1864 near Rostov-on-Don, exemplifies the wealth and artistic sophistication that characterized Alan elite burials of the 1st century AD. Golden diadems worked with intricate animal motifs, silver vessels bearing Greek inscriptions, and weapons inlaid with precious metals demonstrate not merely wealth, but active participation in the broader cultural networks of the ancient world. The horse harnesses recovered from these burial complexes reveal particular insight into Alan military culture and social organisation. Unlike the relatively simple tack employed by earlier Scythian horsemen, Alan harnesses incorporated complex bronze and iron fittings designed for maximum control during mounted combat. Elaborate cheek pieces, often cast in the shape of griffins or other mythological creatures, served both functional and ceremonial purposes. The bits themselves were frequently forged from high-quality iron and featured distinctive twisted mouthpieces that allowed for precise control of war horses during the fluid, tactical manoeuvres that characterize steppe warfare. Weaponry from these burial contexts demonstrates the technological sophistication that enabled Alan military dominance. Long cavalry swords, some exceeding 1 metre in length, were designed specifically for mounted combat, their extended reach allowing warriors to strike effectively while maintaining distance from infantry opponents. The quality of these blades, many showing evidence of pattern welding techniques that created distinctive watered steel effects, indicates access to skilled metalworkers and high-grade raw materials. Alongside these swords, Alan warriors carried composite bows constructed from horn, sinew and wood laminated together to create weapons capable of penetrating armour at considerable distances. Arrow points recovered from burial contexts show remarkable standardization in design and manufacture, suggesting centralized production systems that could equip large numbers of warriors with uniform equipment. The linguistic evidence for Alan origins provides crucial insights into their cultural identity and historical connections. The Alan language belonged to the Eastern Iranian branch of the Indo-European family, sharing fundamental characteristics with the languages spoken by earlier Scythian peoples while maintaining distinct dialectical features. This linguistic continuity suggests that the Alans represented not a completely foreign intrusion into the Pontic Steppes, but rather the latest manifestation of Iranian-speaking nomadic cultures that had dominated the region for centuries. Comparative analysis of Alan linguistic remains, preserved primarily in personal names recorded by Greek and Roman authors, reveals clear connections to both ancient Scythian vocabulary and the modern Ossetian language spoken in the central Caucasus. The Alan word for warrior, preserved in various forms in classical sources, shares cognates with Old Persian military terminology, indicating the preservation of ancient Indo-Iranian martial concepts across centuries of cultural transmission. Personal names like Aspetos, Satraces, and Pharasmanes, recorded in inscriptions and historical texts, demonstrate clear Iranian etymologies while showing phonetic developments characteristic of the Eastern Iranian linguistic branch. The process of Alan ethnogenesis appears to have accelerated during the middle decades of the 1st century AD, as political pressures from both east and west forced smaller Sarmatian tribes to coalesce around more powerful leaders. Chinese sources from this period describe massive population movements in Central Asia as the Xiongnu Confederation collapsed, sending ripple effects across the entire Eurasian steppe system. These demographic pressures created opportunities for ambitious tribal leaders to forge larger political units capable of defending territory and projecting power across greater distances. Alan tribal organisation centred on a warrior aristocracy that combined elements of traditional steppe governance with innovations adapted to the changing political landscape of the early imperial period. At the apex of Alan society stood the warrior kings, individuals who had demonstrated exceptional skill in battle and possessed the charisma necessary to maintain loyalty among the fractious tribal elements that comprised Alan society. These rulers were not absolute monarchs in the Mediterranean sense, but rather first among equals who governed through a combination of personal prestige, martial prowess, and careful distribution of wealth acquired through raiding and tribute collection. Below the royal tier, Alan society was stratified into several distinct classes, each with specific roles and privileges within the broader social structure. The heavy cavalry that formed the core of Alan military power was drawn primarily from the landed aristocracy, warriors who possessed sufficient wealth to maintain the expensive equipment and trained war horses essential for effective mounted combat. These men, known in later sources as the ironclad riders, formed tight-knit military brotherhoods bound together by oaths of mutual loyalty and shared participation in the dangers and rewards of warfare. The pastoral foundation of Alan society required extensive knowledge of animal husbandry, seasonal migration patterns, and grassland management. Alan herders moved their animals across vast territories according to ancient patterns that maximised pasture utilisation while minimising conflict with neighbouring tribes. Cattle, horses and sheep formed the basis of Alan wealth, providing not only sustenance but also the raw materials necessary for clothing, shelter and trade goods. The quality of Alan horses became legendary throughout the ancient world, with Roman sources specifically praising their speed, endurance and suitability for military service. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals that Alan communities maintained both permanent winter quarters and seasonal camps distributed across their territorial range. The winter settlements, typically located in river valleys that provided shelter from harsh steppe winds, contained substantial semi-subterranean structures capable of housing extended families and their most valuable livestock. These dwellings, constructed with stone foundations and timber superstructures covered with felt and hide, could accommodate 20 or more individuals during the harsh months when outdoor life became impossible. The material culture recovered from these sites demonstrates the sophisticated craft production that supported Alan society. Pottery vessels show clear stylistic evolution from earlier Sarmatian traditions while incorporating new decorative elements that would become characteristic of Alan artistic expression. Metalworking evidence includes not only weapons and horse equipment, but also domestic items like cauldrons, knives, and personal ornaments that reveal daily life details often absent from burial contexts. Trade relationships played a crucial role in Alan economic life, connecting the steppe communities to the broader commercial networks that linked Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean world. Alan merchants and raiders brought Chinese silk, Roman glassware and Persian metalwork back to the steppes, while exporting horses, furs and slaves to urban markets throughout the ancient world. This commercial activity required sophisticated knowledge of trade routes, seasonal conditions, and political relationships across vast geographical distances. The religious and burial practices that had crystallized during the formative period of Alan society provided the spiritual foundation for what would become one of history's most successful nomadic expansions. By the late 1st century AD, Alan warbands had begun pushing eastward from their traditional territories along the Don River, following ancient migration routes that stretched across the seemingly endless grasslands toward the distant Aral Sea. This eastward movement represented far more than simple territorial acquisition. It constituted a systematic campaign to control the arterial trade routes that connected the Roman world with the silk markets of Central Asia and the luxury goods of distant China. The geographic scope of Alan territorial expansion during this period staggers the modern imagination. Archaeological evidence from Kurgan burial sites distributed across southern Russia, Kazakhstan, and parts of western Siberia reveals the extent of Alan influence by the 2nd century AD. The Prokhorovka culture, named after a cemetery complex near Orenburg, demonstrates clear Alan material signatures across territories spanning nearly 2,000 kilometres from east to west. Distinctive burial practices, including the interment of warriors with their horses and the placement of specific grave goods like bronze mirrors and glass beads, appear with remarkable consistency across this vast expanse, indicating not merely trade contact but direct political and cultural control. The strategic importance of controlling these territories lay in their position astride the great transcontinental trade arteries. The northern branch of the Silk Road passed directly through Alan-controlled territory, carrying Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Central Asian jade westward toward the Black Sea ports, while Roman manufactured goods, Mediterranean wine, and precious metals flowed eastward toward the markets of Samarkand and Kashgar. Alan leaders quickly grasped that controlling key river crossings, mountain passes, and seasonal camping grounds along these routes could generate enormous wealth through taxation, tribute collection, and direct participation in long-distance commerce. The military innovations that enabled this remarkable expansion built upon traditional steppe warfare techniques, while incorporating new technologies and tactical concepts adapted from contact with sedentary civilizations. The backbone of Alan military power remained the heavy cavalry charge, but 2nd century developments transformed this ancient tactic into something approaching the medieval knight's shock combat. Alan warriors of this period wore scale armour constructed from small iron or bronze plates sewn onto leather backing, creating flexible protection that could deflect arrows and sword cuts, while allowing the mobility essential for mounted warfare. These armour systems, weighing up to 15 kilograms, required extensive training to use effectively and represented a significant investment in equipment that only the warrior elite could afford. The horses that carried these armoured warriors were themselves partially protected by scale barding covering the animal's chest and flanks. Archaeological remains from the Shilovka cemetery complex near Azov reveal horse armour constructed with the same techniques used for human protection, featuring overlapping metal scales that provided coverage without restricting the animal's movement. These war horses, bred specifically for size and strength, stood considerably larger than the ponies used by earlier steppe peoples, measuring 14 to 15 hands at the shoulder and possessing the bone structure necessary to carry an armoured rider through sustained combat. The composite bows carried by Alan warriors represented the pinnacle of ancient projectile weapon technology. Constructed from horn strips, laminated to a wooden core and backed with sinew, these weapons could drive arrows through mail armour at ranges exceeding 300 metres. The manufacturing process required specialized knowledge passed down through generations of bowyers, involving precise selection of materials, careful seasoning of components, and assembly techniques that took months to complete. The arrows themselves were mass-produced in standardized patterns, with iron points designed for specific tactical purposes, bodkin points for penetrating armour, broadheads for unprotected targets, and specialized designs for siege warfare. Alan military organisation during this period reflected the complex demands of controlling vast territories while maintaining the mobility that had always characterised steppe warfare. The basic tactical unit remained the decimal system inherited from earlier nomadic traditions, with squads of 10 warriors commanded by experienced veterans who had proven themselves in battle. These squads combined into hundreds and thousands under the leadership of tribal nobles who owed allegiance to regional war chiefs. At the apex of this military hierarchy stood the great kings, rulers who commanded the loyalty of multiple tribes and could field armies numbering in the tens of thousands. The tactical employment of these forces demonstrated remarkable sophistication in combining traditional steppe mobility with the shock power of heavy cavalry. Alan battle formations typically featured a centre of heavily armoured lancers supported by wings of lighter cavalry armed with composite bows. The initial phase of battle involved extensive skirmishing as the lighter forces sought to disrupt enemy formations with arrow storms, drawing opponents into pursuit that would expose them to devastating charges by the heavy cavalry. This tactical system proved devastatingly effective against both nomadic opponents and the infantry-heavy armies of sedentary states. The interactions between Alan forces and the settled populations along the Black Sea coast evolved from simple raiding to complex tributary relationships that provided steady revenue streams while avoiding the costs of direct occupation. The Greek cities of the Bosporan kingdom, including Panticapaeum, Tanais, and Gorgippia, found themselves increasingly dependent on Alan goodwill for their continued prosperity. Archaeological evidence from these urban centres reveals significant Alan cultural influence during the 2nd century AD, including the adoption of Alan burial practices by local elites and the appearance of Alan-style metalwork in urban contexts. The tribute relationships established with these coastal cities followed patterns that would become characteristic of Alan statecraft throughout their history. Rather than demanding crushing payments that would destroy local prosperity, Alan leaders imposed moderate but regular tribute obligations that allowed subject communities to maintain their economic vitality while providing steady income to the nomadic confederation. These arrangements often included provisions for military cooperation, with subject cities expected to provide naval transport, siege equipment, or specialised craftsmen when Alan forces required such support. The internal structure of Alan society during this period of expansion revealed increasing complexity as success brought new challenges of administration and control. The original tribal divisions that had characterised early Alan organisation persisted but became overlaid with new hierarchies based on territorial control and military command. The Antai, Roxolani and Iazyges emerged as distinct subgroups within the broader Alan confederation, each controlling specific territorial ranges and maintaining varying degrees of nomadic lifestyle. The Antai, whose name appears in both Roman and Chinese sources from this period, controlled the easternmost territories of Alan expansion, ranging across the steppes north of the Caspian Sea toward the Aral Sea basin. These groups maintained the most traditional nomadic lifestyle, following seasonal migration patterns that could span hundreds of kilometres as they moved their herds between winter and summer pastures. Their burial sites, characterised by simple kurgan construction and traditional grave goods, suggest conservative cultural practices that preserved ancient steppe traditions, even as other Alan groups adapted to new circumstances. The Roxolani occupied the central territories of Alan expansion, controlling the crucial region between the Don and Volga rivers that served as the heartland of Alan power. This group developed the most sophisticated political institutions, including formal kingship structures that combine traditional steppe leadership with administrative innovations borrowed from contact with sedentary civilizations. Roxolani settlements show evidence of craft specialization, including workshops for metalworking, leather production, and textile manufacture that supported both military needs and long-distance trade. The Azygis controlled the western territories closest to the Roman frontier, ranging from the Don River to the Carpathian foothills. Their proximity to Roman territory exposed them to continuous cultural exchange that gradually modified traditional steppe practices. The Azygis' burial sites from the 2nd century AD contain increasing quantities of Roman-manufactured goods, including glassware, coins, and luxury items that indicate extensive trade relationships. Some Yazidis groups adopted semi-sedentary lifestyles, establishing permanent settlements that served as bases for agricultural experiments and craft production. The degree of nomadism practiced by different Alan subgroups varied considerably based on local environmental conditions and economic opportunities. Groups controlling territories with reliable water sources and fertile pastures could maintain traditional pastoral nomadism, moving their herds according to ancient seasonal patterns that maximized grass utilization. Other groups, particularly those in marginal environments or areas with significant sedentary populations, developed mixed economies that combined pastoralism with agriculture, trade, and tribute collection. The environmental adaptations required for successful expansion across such diverse territories demonstrate the flexibility that characterized Alan culture during this period. The western territories controlled by the Yazidis featured the rich grasslands and mild climate of the Pontic Steppes, ideal for traditional horse and cattle pastoralism. Moving eastward, Alan groups encountered increasingly arid conditions that required different herding strategies and greater reliance on sheep and goats rather than cattle. The easternmost territories near the Aral Sea presented desert steppe conditions that demanded specialized knowledge of water sources and seasonal migration patterns. The technological adaptations developed for these diverse environments included innovations in transportation, water storage, and shelter construction. Alan groups operating in arid regions developed improved cart designs that could carry larger water supplies across waterless stretches, while those in forested regions adapted their equipment for river crossings and woodland warfare. The felt-making techniques that provided essential materials for nomadic shelters were refined to produce different weights and textures suitable for varying climatic conditions. The administrative challenges of controlling such vast territories led to innovations in communication and command structures that would influence steppe governance for centuries. Alan leaders developed systems of mounted messengers who could carry orders and information across hundreds of kilometers, following established routes that connected regional centers with the mobile courts of tribal kings. These communication networks enabled coordinated military campaigns across multiple theatres and facilitated the collection of tribute from distant subject populations. The economic integration of conquered territories required sophisticated understanding of local production systems and trade relationships. Alan administrators learned to work within existing commercial networks rather than disrupting them, collecting tribute in forms that could be easily transported and converted to military resources. This approach maximized revenue while minimizing administrative overhead, allowing relatively small numbers of Alan nobles to control large subject populations through indirect rule systems that preserved local autonomy in exchange for regular tribute payments. The sophisticated administrative systems that had enabled Alan control over vast steppe territories would soon face their greatest test as Roman legions began probing northward from their Anatolian bases during the middle decades of the 1st century AD. The initial encounters between these two military powers occurred not through grand strategic design, but as the inevitable consequence of Roman expansion into the Caucasus region, colliding with established Alan raiding patterns that had long treated Armenia and Cappadocia as profitable hunting grounds for slaves, livestock, and portable wealth. The first documented clash between Alan warriors and Roman forces took place in 35 AD during the reign of Tiberius, when a substantial Alan raiding force crossed the Darial Pass through the central Caucasus and struck deep into Roman Armenia. The Roman historian Tacitus provides a vivid account of this incursion, describing how Alan cavalry appeared like a thundercloud across the Armenian highlands, their scale armour glinting in the mountain sunlight as they descended upon unprepared settlements. The raiders moved with characteristic steppe efficiency, dividing into smaller groups that could strike multiple targets simultaneously, while maintaining communication through an elaborate system of horn signals that echoed across the mountain valleys. The Roman response revealed both the strengths and limitations of legionary warfare when confronted with highly mobile steppe cavalry. Lucius Vitellius, the governor of Syria, dispatched elements of the 6th Legion Ferrata, along with auxiliary units drawn from local Armenian and Cappadocian recruits to intercept the raiders. The Roman forces, trained for set-piece battles against infantry opponents, struggled to engage an enemy that refused to accept battle on Roman terms. Alan tactics during this campaign demonstrated their mastery of hit-and-run warfare, striking Roman supply columns and isolated garrisons before melting away into the mountainous terrain that provided natural sanctuary from legionary pursuit. The equipment disparities between the opposing forces became apparent during the few direct engagements that occurred. Roman legionaries, weighed down by their standardized kit of lorica segmentata armor, rectangular shields, and short gladii, found themselves at severe disadvantage against mounted opponents who could strike from horseback with long cavalry spears before wheeling away beyond the reach of Roman weapons. The auxiliary cavalry attached to Roman forces, primarily recruited from Germanic tribes or Gallic communities, lacked both the equipment and tactical training necessary to match Alan heavy cavalry in mounted combat. Alan military equipment during these early encounters represented centuries of refinement in steppe warfare technology. Their scale armour, constructed from thousands of small iron or bronze plates sewn onto leather backing, provided excellent protection against both missile weapons and cutting attacks, while maintaining the flexibility essential for mounted combat. The scales themselves, typically measuring 2 to 3 centimetres in length, were carefully shaped and hardened to deflect blows while overlapping to prevent gaps that might admit enemy weapons. This armour system, weighing between 12 and 15 kilograms, distributed its weight across the warrior's entire torso, allowing sustained combat without the fatigue that plagued infantry, wearing heavier but more restrictive armour designs. The long cavalry spears carried by Alan heavy cavalry, known as kontos in Greek sources, measured between 3 and 4 metres in length and featured iron points specifically designed for penetrating armour. These weapons required extensive training to use effectively from horseback, as their length made them unwieldy in close combat, but devastatingly effective during the initial charge when properly employed. The wooden shafts, typically constructed from ash or other flexible hardwoods, were carefully balanced to provide maximum striking power, while remaining manageable for a mounted warrior controlling his horse with his knees and left hand. The aftermath of the 35 AD raid established patterns that would characterise Roman-Alan relations for the next 2 centuries. The Alan forces withdrew across the Caucasus with substantial booty, including thousands of captives who would be sold in the slave markets of the Black Sea coast or ransomed back to their families. Roman attempts at pursuit proved futile, as legionary forces lacked both the mobility and local knowledge necessary to track nomadic raiders across unfamiliar mountain terrain. The Romans were forced to content themselves with strengthening frontier fortifications and negotiating with local client kings for improved intelligence about nomadic movements. The diplomatic initiatives that emerged from these early conflicts revealed Roman pragmatism in dealing with military problems that could not be solved through conventional conquest. Rather than attempting to pacify the entire Caucasus region through direct occupation, Roman administrators began exploring tributary relationships that might channel Allan military energy toward Roman objectives while reducing threats to Roman territory. These negotiations, conducted through intermediaries drawn from the Greek cities of the Black Sea coast, established precedents for the complex alliance systems that would later characterize Roman-barbarian relations along the northern frontier. The first formal treaty arrangements between Rome and Allan tribal leaders emerged during the reign of Nero, when Roman forces became heavily committed to campaigns in Britain and along the Rhine frontier. The manpower shortages created by these distant commitments forced Roman commanders to seek alternative sources of military strength, particularly cavalry units that could match the mounted warriors of Parthia and other eastern enemies. Allan tribal leaders, recognizing an opportunity to legitimize their raiding activities while gaining access to Roman wealth, proved receptive to proposals for military cooperation. The initial foederati arrangements established during this period created a template that would be refined and expanded over subsequent centuries. Allan tribal contingents, typically numbering between 500 and 1,000 warriors, would serve alongside Roman forces for specified campaign seasons in exchange for regular payments in gold, provisions, and military equipment. These agreements included provisions for the families of serving warriors who received protection and subsistence from Roman authorities while their men campaigned in distant theatres. The legal framework for these arrangements drew upon existing Roman practices for dealing with allied Italian communities, adapted to accommodate the nomadic lifestyle and tribal organisation of steppe peoples. The integration of Allan cavalry units into Roman military operations required significant adaptations on both sides. Roman commanders had to learn new tactical concepts that could effectively employ highly mobile mounted forces within the context of legionary warfare, while Allan warriors needed to adapt their traditional fighting methods to coordinate with infantry formations and siege operations. The process proved challenging, as the individualistic warrior culture of the steppes often conflicted with Roman military discipline and standardized procedures. The first major test of these new alliance relationships occurred during Corbulo's Armenian campaigns of 58, 63 AD, when substantial Allan contingents served alongside Roman forces in operations against the Parthian Empire. The mountainous terrain of eastern Anatolia and the Armenian highlands provided ideal conditions for Allan tactical methods, as their mobility allowed them to conduct reconnaissance missions, raid enemy supply lines, and screen Roman troop movements from Parthian cavalry. Contemporary accounts describe Allan warriors wearing their traditional scale armour, but carrying Roman-manufactured weapons and equipment alongside their traditional arms. The performance of Allan units during these campaigns impressed Roman observers and led to expanded recruitment efforts throughout the Caucasus region. The military historian Frontinus, writing in the late 1st century, specifically praised the effectiveness of Allan cavalry in mountain warfare, noting their ability to traverse terrain impassable to Roman cavalry while maintaining communication with main force elements through their sophisticated signal systems. The success of these early experiments with barbarian foederati would influence Roman military policy for centuries, establishing precedents for the large-scale employment of Germanic, Sarmatian, and other tribal contingents in later periods. The cultural exchange that accompanied these military relationships manifested in various forms of material evidence recovered from archaeological contexts throughout the region. Roman coins began appearing in Allan burial sites during the late 1st century AD, initially as isolated finds but increasingly as regular grave goods, indicating systematic contact with Roman monetary systems. The distribution patterns of these coins reveal the extent of Roman payments to Allan tribal leaders, with concentrations appearing in Kurgan burials across the northern Black Sea region and extending eastward along traditional Allan territorial ranges. The adoption of Roman military equipment by Alan warriors proceeded gradually, with individual items being incorporated into traditional weapon systems, rather than wholesale replacement of steppe military technology. Roman manufactured sword blades, recognizable by their distinctive metallurgy and construction techniques, appear mounted in traditional Alan hilts and scabbards, decorated with steppe artistic motifs. Similarly, Roman helmet designs were modified with additional cheek guards and neck protections suitable for mounted combat, while maintaining the distinctive crest attachments that served both ceremonial and practical functions in steppe warfare. The reverse flow of cultural influence saw Roman military units stationed along the eastern frontier adopting elements of steppe cavalry equipment and tactics. Archaeological evidence from Roman military sites in Cappadocia and Armenia reveals the presence of composite bow fragments, scale armour elements, and horse equipment showing clear steppe influence. Roman auxiliary cavalry units, particularly those recruited from populations with existing nomadic traditions, increasingly employed Alan-style tactics and equipment, as Roman commanders recognized their effectiveness in frontier warfare. The establishment of regular diplomatic contact between Roman provincial governors and Alan tribal leaders created communication channels that would prove crucial during subsequent military crises. These relationships, maintained through annual embassies and gift exchanges, provided Roman intelligence services with valuable information about political developments in the steppes, while giving Alan leaders access to Roman manufactured goods and luxury items that enhanced their prestige among tribal followers. The diplomatic protocols developed during this period, including the use of hostage exchanges and marriage alliances, would become standard features of Roman barbarian policy. The expansion of these relationships during the 2nd century AD coincided with increasing pressure on the Danube frontier from Germanic migrations and Dacian expansion. Roman commanders in the region, facing threats that stretched their available forces beyond effective limits, actively recruited Alan contingents to supplement legionary strength. These recruitment efforts, coordinated through the established diplomatic networks, brought increasing numbers of Alan warriors into direct contact with Roman military organisation and imperial administrative systems. The Alan contingents serving along the Danube frontier during the Dacian Wars of 106 AD provided Roman forces with crucial mobility advantages in the difficult terrain of the Carpathian foothills. Their ability to conduct long-range reconnaissance missions and maintain communication between separated Roman columns proved invaluable during the complex manoeuvring that characterized these campaigns. The integration of Alan tactical methods with Roman strategic planning created combined arms capabilities that would influence Roman military doctrine throughout the imperial period. The material rewards flowing from these military relationships transformed Alan society in ways that extended far beyond simple wealth accumulation. Access to Roman manufactured goods, particularly high-quality metalwork and luxury items, created new status hierarchies within Alan tribal structures, as successful war leaders could distribute prestigious foreign goods to their followers. The regular payment schedules associated with feudatory service provided predictable income streams that reduced dependence on traditional raiding activities while maintaining the military skills essential for tribal survival. The diplomatic and military relationships that had developed between Alan tribal confederations and Roman provincial authorities during the 2nd century AD would face unprecedented strain as seismic shifts in the political geography of Central Asia began reverberating westward across the Eurasian steppes. The emergence of the Hunnic Confederation in the regions east of the Caspian Sea during the late 3rd century represented a fundamental disruption to the balance of power that had allowed Alan groups to maintain their territorial dominance across the vast grasslands stretching from the Don River to the Aral Sea basin. Archaeological evidence from abandoned settlement sites across the Pontic Steppes reveals the sudden nature of this disruption through layers of ash and destruction dating to the 360s and 370s AD. The winter quarters at Tanais, which had served as a major Alan administrative centre for over 2 centuries, show clear signs of hasty abandonment during this period. Excavations have uncovered partially completed metal-working projects, unfinished pottery vessels still on their wheels, and scattered personal belongings that suggest inhabitants fled with minimal preparation. The absence of human remains in these destruction layers indicates that the population had sufficient warning to evacuate, but the speed of abandonment reveals the urgency of the threat they faced. The Hunnic expansion westward represented more than simple territorial conquest. It constituted a systematic campaign to control the transcontinental trade routes that had provided the economic foundation for Alan prosperity. The Huns possessed military technologies and tactical innovations that gave them decisive advantages over traditional steppe warfare methods. Their composite bows, constructed with advanced lamination techniques that incorporated bone reinforcements at stress points, could drive arrows through scale armour at ranges exceeding 400 metres. More importantly, Hunnic military organisation featured centralised command structures that enabled coordinated operations across multiple theatres simultaneously, a capability that fragmented Alan tribal confederations could not match. The initial Hunnic assaults targeted the easternmost Alan territories, striking first at the anti-groups controlling the approaches to the Aral Sea. The speed of Hunnic cavalry, mounted on smaller but more enduring horses bred specifically for sustained campaigning, allowed them to outmaneuver Alan heavy cavalry formations that had dominated steppe warfare for centuries. Hunnic tactical doctrine emphasised rapid concentration of forces at decisive points, overwhelming isolated Alan tribal groups before they could coordinate effective resistance or receive support from neighbouring confederations. The collapse of Alan resistance in the Eastern Territories created cascading effects throughout their territorial empire. The tribute systems that had sustained Alan military capabilities depended on control of specific geographic features, river crossings, mountain passes, and seasonal camping grounds that channeled trade traffic through Alan-administered territories. As Hunnic forces seized these strategic points, the economic foundation of Alan power began crumbling, forcing tribal leaders to choose between costly resistance campaigns they could not afford and strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions. The formation of the first major migration waves began in the winter of 374 AD, when the Roxolani Confederation abandoned their traditional territories between the Don and Volga rivers. Contemporary Roman sources describe columns of Alan refugees stretching across the horizon, their wagons loaded with portable wealth and essential supplies, while vast herds of livestock accompanied the human exodus. The organisation of these movements required sophisticated logistical planning, as tens of thousands of people and animals needed to be moved across hundreds of kilometres while maintaining defensive capabilities against Hunnic pursuit. The migration routes chosen by different Alan groups reflected both geographic constraints and strategic considerations that would determine their subsequent historical development. The northern route, followed primarily by groups seeking to maintain traditional nomadic lifestyles, led toward the forests and river systems of what would become medieval Russia. These migrants faced the challenge of adapting their pastoral economy to environments with shorter growing seasons and different vegetation patterns, but they retained a greater independence from external political pressures. The southern migration route attracted Alan groups willing to accept tributary relationships in exchange for territorial security. This path led through the Caucasus Mountains toward territories controlled by the Sassanid Persian Empire and the various client kingdoms of the region. The mountain passes of the central Caucasus, particularly the Dariel Pass that had served as a traditional raiding route into Roman Armenia, now became corridors for mass population movements as entire tribal confederations sought refuge in the highlands. The establishment of Alan settlements in the North Caucasus region during this period laid the demographic and cultural foundations for developments that would persist for over a millennium. The geographic advantages of the Caucasus Mountains, defensible terrain, adequate pasture for livestock, and strategic position controlling access between the steppes and the civilized world made them ideal for communities seeking to preserve their cultural identity while adapting to changed political circumstances. The Kazbegi region of modern Georgia contains extensive archaeological evidence of Alan settlement during the late 4th century. Fortified positions constructed on mountain spurs show clear Alan architectural influences, including the use of dry stone construction techniques and defensive layouts designed for mounted warfare. These settlements featured specialized areas for metalworking, leather production, and other crafts essential for maintaining military capabilities in an isolated mountain environment. The discovery of coin hoards containing both Roman and Sassanid issues indicates that these communities maintained commercial relationships with both major powers while preserving their political independence. The Ossetian valleys of the central Caucasus became the primary centre of Alan cultural preservation during this migration period. The geographic isolation provided by mountain terrain allowed Alan communities to maintain their traditional social structures and religious practices while gradually adapting to the requirements of highland life. Archaeological investigations in these valleys have revealed continuous occupation from the late 4th century through the medieval period, with material culture showing clear continuity from earlier steppe traditions, while incorporating new elements adapted to mountain environments. The linguistic evidence for this settlement process demonstrates the gradual evolution of Alan's speech patterns as communities adapted to their new environments. The Ossetian language, which preserves more archaic Iranian features than any other living language in the family, shows clear influences from the languages of neighbouring Caucasian peoples during this period. Loanwords relating to agriculture, mountain warfare, and highland crafts entered Ossetian vocabulary, while traditional pastoral terminology was preserved alongside new concepts required for life in vertical terrain. The strategic alliances formed between migrating Alan groups and other barbarian tribes represented pragmatic responses to the Hunnic threat that would reshape the political landscape of Eastern Europe. The Gothic confederations controlling territories in modern Ukraine and Romania faced similar pressures from Hunnic expansion, creating natural conditions for cooperation between traditional enemies. These alliances required careful negotiation, as both Alan and Gothic leaders needed to balance immediate military necessities against long-term tribal interests. The first documented Alan Gothic military cooperation occurred during the winter of 375 AD, when combined forces attempted to halt Hunnic advances along the Dniester River. The battle formations employed during this campaign demonstrated remarkable adaptation, with Alan heavy cavalry providing the shock power for Gothic infantry formations, while Gothic archers supplemented Alan-mounted archery capabilities. The tactical integration achieved during these operations would influence barbarian military organisation for decades, establishing precedents for the combined arms approaches that would characterise later Germanic kingdoms. The material culture produced during these alliance periods shows clear evidence of technological exchange between different barbarian groups. Gothic metalworking techniques, particularly their advanced methods for producing pattern-welded sword blades, began appearing in Alan weapon assemblages recovered from 4th century burial contexts. Conversely, Alan horse equipment and cavalry tactics were adopted by Gothic warriors, creating hybrid military systems that combine the best features of both traditions. The diplomatic protocols established for these alliances drew upon traditional steppe practices while incorporating elements borrowed from Roman and Persian diplomatic customs. Hostage exchanges, marriage alliances, and ritual gift-giving ceremonies created bonds between tribal leaders that transcended immediate military cooperation. These relationships, maintained through regular assemblies and shared religious observances, provided the social foundation for larger political confederations that could resist Hunnic pressure more effectively than isolated tribal groups. The religious dimensions of these alliances reflected the complex spiritual landscape of 4th century barbarian Europe. Alan traditional beliefs, centered on fire worship and sky god veneration, inherited from their Iranian ancestors, found common ground with Gothic practices that had been influenced by contact with Roman Christianity. The syncretic religious ceremonies that emerged from these interactions created shared ritual spaces where different tribal groups could participate in collective activities that reinforced their military partnerships. The economic aspects of Alan Gothic cooperation involved sophisticated arrangements for sharing the costs and benefits of military campaigns. Tribute collection systems were coordinated to avoid conflicts between allied groups, while captured wealth was distributed according to negotiated formulas that reflected each group's contribution to joint operations. These economic arrangements required detailed record-keeping and dispute resolution mechanisms that drew upon the administrative traditions of both cultures. The impact of these migration movements on the settled populations of the regions affected was profound and lasting. The Greek cities of the Black Sea coast, which had maintained profitable relationships with Alan confederations for centuries, found themselves forced to navigate between competing barbarian groups while managing the economic disruption caused by interrupted trade routes. Archaeological evidence from Tanais, Panticapaeum, and other coastal centres reveals significant population decline during this period, as urban communities struggled to maintain their commercial functions without the stability provided by established tribal relationships. The Roman frontier provinces experienced similar disruptions as traditional buffer arrangements collapsed under Hunnic pressure. The foederati relationships that had provided Rome with reliable cavalry contingents for over 2 centuries became increasingly unreliable as Alan tribal leaders focused on the immediate survival needs of their communities. Roman military commanders found themselves forced to develop new strategic concepts that could address threats from multiple directions simultaneously, while managing the humanitarian crisis created by massive refugee movements. The administrative challenges posed by these population movements exceeded the capacity of existing governmental structures throughout the region. Roman provincial authorities, trained to deal with relatively stable frontier conditions, struggled to develop policies that could accommodate tens of thousands of displaced nomads while maintaining security and economic stability. The solutions that emerged during this period, including the establishment of special settlement zones and modified tributary arrangements, would influence imperial barbarian policy throughout the later empire. The cultural transformations initiated during the migration period would accelerate dramatically as the Hunnic Confederation, under its early leaders, began implementing systematic campaigns designed to eliminate Alan resistance throughout the Pontic Steppes. Unlike the gradual territorial adjustments that had characterized previous centuries of steppe warfare, the Hunnic advance represented a coordinated effort to destroy the political and economic foundations of Alan power across their entire territorial range. The winter of 376 AD witnessed the final collapse of organised Alan resistance east of the Don River as the last major Roxolani strongholds fell to sustained Hunnic assault. The archaeological record from this period reveals the devastating thoroughness of Hunnic military operations through systematic destruction layers found across dozens of Alan settlement sites. The fortress complex at Elizavetovskoe, which had served as a regional administrative centre for over a century, shows evidence of deliberate demolition that went far beyond simple conquest. Stone walls were pulled down to their foundations, metalworking facilities were destroyed with their tools scattered and broken, and storage areas were systematically emptied before being burned. This pattern of comprehensive destruction suggests Hunnic forces were following specific orders to eliminate Alan capabilities for future resistance, rather than simply occupying conquered territory. The speed of Hunnic tactical operations overwhelmed Alan defensive preparations that had been designed for traditional steppe warfare. Hunnic cavalry formations, organised in decimal units of 10, 100 and 1,000 riders, could coordinate complex manoeuvres across vast distances through sophisticated signal systems that employed horns, banners and mounted messengers. Their horses, bred for endurance rather than the size and strength emphasised in Alan heavy cavalry mounts, could maintain operational tempo for days without rest, allowing Hunnic commanders to strike multiple targets in rapid succession before defenders could organise coordinated responses. The technological advantages that enabled Hunnic dominance extended beyond their famous composite bows to include innovations in armour, weapons and battlefield communications. Hunnic warriors wore lamellar armour constructed from small rectangular plates laced together with leather cords, creating flexible protection that weighed significantly less than traditional Alan-scale armour, while providing comparable defensive capability. This weight reduction allowed Hunnic cavalry to maintain higher speeds during extended operations, a crucial advantage when conducting the rapid concentration and dispersal tactics that characterised their military doctrine. The collapse of the Yazidis' confederation in the Western Territories occurred during the spring campaigning season of 376 AD, when Hunnic forces crossed the Don River in overwhelming strength and advanced rapidly toward the Dniester basin. The Yazidis, who had maintained the most extensive diplomatic relationships with Roman provincial authorities, attempted to coordinate their resistance with Gothic tribal groups already under pressure from Hunnic expansion. This cooperation, formalised through emergency assemblies held in the Carpathian foothills, represented the first systematic attempt by different barbarian confederations to present unified opposition to Hunnic conquest. The combined Alan Gothic forces that assembled near modern Chisinau numbered approximately 15,000 warriors, including 4,000 Alan heavy cavalry, 6,000 Gothic infantry, and 5,000 mixed auxiliary troops drawn from smaller tribal groups. The battle formation adopted for this confrontation placed Alan cavalry on the wings with Gothic spearmen forming a central phalanx, a tactical arrangement that required extensive coordination between forces accustomed to independent operation. The Hunnic response demonstrated their superior strategic mobility, as they avoided direct confrontation with this concentrated force, while striking simultaneously at the dispersed families and livestock that represented the economic foundation of both confederations. The aftermath of this strategic defeat forced massive population movements, as both Alan and Gothic leaders recognised their inability to maintain territorial control against Hunnic pressure. The migration streams that emerged during the summer of 376 AD represented the largest coordinated population movements in European history to that point, with contemporary Roman sources describing refugee columns that stretched across the horizon for days at a time. These movements required unprecedented logistical organisation, as tribal leaders needed to coordinate the movement of entire populations while maintaining defensive capabilities and ensuring adequate supplies for journeys that might last for months. The leadership structure that emerged during these migrations reflected the desperate circumstances facing displaced populations. Traditional tribal hierarchies, based on kinship relationships and territorial control, gave way to more flexible arrangements that emphasized military capability and diplomatic skill. Leaders like Respendiel and Goar, whose names appear in Roman sources from this period, gained prominence through their ability to negotiate safe passage through hostile territory and secure temporary settlements for their followers. These men represented a new type of barbarian leadership, combining traditional warrior skills with the diplomatic sophistication necessary for survival in an increasingly complex political environment. Respendiel's confederation, which included substantial Alan elements alongside Gothic and Suebi tribal groups, demonstrated remarkable organisational capability during their westward movement through modern Romania and Hungary. Roman observers noted the disciplined nature of these migrations, with advance parties securing river crossings and supply depots while main force elements moved in organised columns that maintained defensive formations even during routine travel. The integration of different tribal groups within these migration streams required constant negotiation and compromise, as traditional enemies found themselves forced to cooperate for mutual survival. The route taken by Respendiel's forces led through the Carpathian passes toward the Danube frontier, where Roman military commanders faced unprecedented challenges in managing the humanitarian crisis created by these massive refugee movements. The provincial authorities in Pannonia and Dacia, already stretched thin by ongoing military commitments along other frontier sectors, lacked both the resources and administrative experience necessary for dealing with displaced populations numbering in the tens of thousands. The negotiations that ensued between Roman officials and barbarian leaders established precedents for refugee management that would influence imperial policy throughout the later empire. Goa's confederation followed a more southern route that led through Dacian territory toward the lower Danube crossing points. This group, which included significant numbers of Alan warriors alongside Suebi and other tribal elements, faced different challenges as they traversed territories still under nominal Roman control. The diplomatic protocols required for these movements involved complex negotiations with multiple Roman commanders, local civilian authorities, and other barbarian groups already settled in the region. Goa's success in managing these relationships demonstrated the sophisticated political skills that characterized the new generation of barbarian leadership emerging from the migration crisis. The integration of these diverse tribal elements into coherent military and political units represented a remarkable achievement in cross-cultural cooperation. Alan cavalry tactics were combined with Germanic infantry formations and Suebi siege techniques to create combined arms capabilities that exceeded the military potential of any single tribal group. This tactical integration required extensive training and coordination, as warriors accustomed to independent operation learned to function as components of larger, more complex military systems. The winter of 376-377 AD saw these confederated forces establishing temporary settlements along the Danube frontier while negotiating with Roman authorities for permission to cross into imperial territory. These negotiations, conducted through interpreters and intermediaries drawn from the Greek cities of the Black Sea coast, involved complex discussions of legal status, settlement rights, and military obligations. The Roman position, articulated through provincial governors acting under instructions from the imperial court, emphasized the empire's willingness to accept barbarian settlers in exchange for military service and tribute payments. The crossing of the Danube by these confederated forces during the spring of 377 AD marked a crucial transition in the relationship between Rome and the barbarian world. Unlike earlier barbarian incursions, which had typically involved raiding parties seeking portable wealth, these movements represented entire populations seeking permanent resettlement within imperial territory. The administrative challenges posed by this situation exceeded existing Roman capabilities, forcing the development of new policies and procedures that would shape imperial-barbarian relations for generations. The settlement patterns established during this initial resettlement phase reflected both Roman strategic priorities and barbarian preferences for familiar environmental conditions. Alan groups, accustomed to the open grasslands of the Pontic Steppes, gravitated toward territories in Pannonia and eastern Gaul that provided adequate pasture for their livestock while offering access to trade routes and urban markets. The Roman authorities, recognizing the military value of Alan cavalry, generally accommodated these preferences while ensuring that barbarian settlements remained under imperial supervision. The events of 406 AD, when massive barbarian confederations crossed the frozen Rhine River into Gaul, represented the culmination of processes that had begun 3 decades earlier with the initial Hunnic expansion. The forces that participated in this crossing included substantial Alan contingents that had spent the intervening years adapting to life within or adjacent to Roman territory, while maintaining their military capabilities and cultural identity. The leadership structure of these crossing forces reflected the complex political evolution that had occurred during the migration period, with Alan nobles like Goa and Respendiel commanding mixed tribal armies that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. The Vandal-Suebi confederation that led the Rhine crossing included approximately 3,000 Alan heavy cavalry among its total strength of roughly 20,000 warriors. These Alan forces retained their traditional military equipment and tactical methods, while incorporating new elements learned through decades of cooperation with Germanic tribal groups. Their scale armour had been modified with additional protection for extended campaigning, while their weapons showed influences from Germanic metalworking techniques that had been adapted to steppe warfare requirements. The crossing itself, accomplished during the harsh winter conditions that had frozen the Rhine sufficiently to support the weight of loaded wagons and cavalry formations, demonstrated the sophisticated logistical planning that characterized barbarian military operations during this period. Advance parties had secured crossing points and established supply depots on the western bank, while main force elements crossed in organised waves that maintained defensive formations throughout the operation. The Roman frontier forces, weakened by troop withdrawals for other military commitments, could offer only token resistance to this massive incursion. The immediate aftermath of the Rhine crossing saw the rapid dispersal of barbarian forces throughout Gaul as different tribal groups pursued separate objectives. The Alan contingents, operating under leaders who had maintained diplomatic relationships with various Gallic communities, moved toward territories that offered favourable conditions for their traditional pastoral economy, while providing access to the commercial networks that connected Gaul with the broader Mediterranean world. Their movements were guided by intelligence gathered through decades of contact with Roman merchants, Christian missionaries, and other travellers who had provided detailed information about conditions in the western provinces. The settlement of Alan communities in Orleans represented a strategic choice that reflected their leaders' understanding of Gallic political geography. The city's position at the confluence of major river systems provided access to both overland and water-based transportation networks, while the surrounding countryside offered adequate pasture for livestock and agricultural land suitable for diversified farming. The local Gallic population, weakened by decades of civil warfare and barbarian raiding, offered minimal resistance to Alan settlement, while providing essential knowledge about local conditions and commercial opportunities. The establishment of Alan communities in Valence followed similar strategic logic, as the city's location in the Rhone Valley provided access to Mediterranean trade routes, while the surrounding highlands offered familiar terrain for communities accustomed to mountain warfare and pastoral economy. The integration of Alan settlers into existing urban and rural structures required complex negotiations with local authorities, who needed to balance the military advantages of barbarian alliance against the economic and social disruption caused by large-scale population movements. The administrative arrangements developed for these settlements created hybrid governmental structures that combined Roman legal traditions with barbarian customary law. Alan nobles retained authority over their tribal followers while accepting ultimate Roman sovereignty, a compromise that allowed both sides to maintain essential interests while adapting to changed circumstances. These arrangements included provisions for military service, tribute payments, and dispute resolution that drew upon both Roman and barbarian legal traditions. The economic integration of Alan communities into Gallic society proceeded through multiple channels that reflected the diverse skills and resources these settlers brought to their new territories. Traditional pastoral activities continued on a reduced scale, with Alan herders adapting their techniques to local environmental conditions while maintaining the horse breeding capabilities that had always formed the foundation of their military power. Simultaneously, Alan craftsmen began producing goods for local markets, particularly metalwork and leather products that incorporated traditional steppe techniques with materials and designs adapted to Gallic preferences. The military contributions of settled Alan communities to regional defence became increasingly important, as other barbarian groups continued to threaten Gallic security throughout the early 5th century. However, the death of Attila in 453 AD and the subsequent collapse of Hunnic hegemony across Central Europe created new opportunities for Alan leaders to expand their territorial control and political influence beyond their initial settlement areas. The power vacuum left by retreating Hunnic forces allowed established Alan communities in Orleans and Valence to extend their authority over surrounding territories while maintaining their federati obligations to whatever Roman authority remained functional in their regions. The transformation of Alan military service from temporary campaigning to permanent territorial defence reflected broader changes in the nature of post-Roman governance throughout Gaul. As imperial administrative structures weakened or disappeared entirely, local communities increasingly relied on barbarian federates to provide essential security services that Roman garrisons could no longer deliver. Alan cavalry units, with their superior mobility and battlefield effectiveness, became crucial components of regional defence systems that protected agricultural production, trade routes, and urban centres from raiders and rival barbarian groups. The Battle of Chalons in 451 AD had demonstrated the continued military value of Alan heavy cavalry when properly integrated with other forces. Alan contingents serving under their leader Sangiban had initially been suspected of potential treachery by Roman and Visigothic commanders, leading to their placement in the centre of the Allied battle line, where they could be monitored by trusted units. However, when Hunnic forces launched their main assault, the Alan cavalry performed with distinction, their scale-armoured riders charging repeatedly into Hunnic formations while maintaining disciplined ranks despite heavy casualties. The effectiveness of Alan tactics during this engagement reinforced their reputation among both Roman and Germanic military leaders, leading to increased demand for their services in subsequent campaigns. The administrative arrangements governing Alan federati service evolved considerably during the decades following Chalons, as both Roman officials and barbarian leaders adapted to the realities of a weakened imperial authority. Rather than the temporary seasonal service that had characterized earlier federati relationships, Alan communities increasingly provided permanent garrisons for specific territories in exchange for formal recognition of their settlement rights and administrative autonomy. These arrangements typically granted Alan leaders authority over their tribal followers, while requiring them to coordinate with Roman provincial governors or their successors in matters affecting broader regional security. The legal framework supporting these expanded federati relationships drew upon existing Roman precedents while incorporating barbarian customary practices that reflected the realities of tribal organisation. Alan nobles retained traditional authority over internal tribal affairs, including dispute resolution, marriage arrangements, and religious observances, while accepting Roman jurisdiction over matters involving non-Alan populations or intertribal conflicts. These hybrid legal systems required constant negotiation and compromise, as Roman legal principles based on written law and individual citizenship conflicted with barbarian traditions emphasizing collective responsibility and oral custom. The establishment of permanent Alan settlements in the Loire Valley region represented a significant evolution from their earlier temporary encampments near Orléans. Archaeological evidence from sites like Fleury-sur-Loire and Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire reveals the construction of substantial fortified compounds during the mid-5th century, featuring stone foundations that supported timber superstructures designed for both residential and defensive purposes. These settlements incorporated traditional Alan architectural elements, including specialized areas for horse care and equipment storage, while adapting to local building materials and construction techniques that reflected their permanent nature. The layout of these Loire Valley settlements demonstrated sophisticated understanding of defensive requirements and economic necessities. The main residential areas, protected by earthwork ramparts topped with wooden palisades, contained rectangular buildings that housed extended families according to traditional Alan social organisation. Separate compounds within the fortified perimeter accommodated workshops for metalworking, leather production, and textile manufacture, while designated areas outside the main defences provided space for livestock management and seasonal agricultural activities. The positioning of these settlements near river crossings and major roadways reflected their dual function as military strongpoints and commercial centres. The integration of Alan communities into the existing economic networks of the Loire Valley required significant adaptation on both sides, as traditional steppe pastoral practices needed modification for the different environmental conditions and market demands of Gallic territory. Alan herders gradually shifted their emphasis from the cattle and sheep that had dominated steppe pastoralism toward horse breeding programs that could supply the cavalry mounts increasingly demanded by military commanders throughout post-Roman Gaul. The superior quality of Alan-bred horses, trained specifically for mounted combat and possessing the size and stamina necessary for carrying armoured riders, created profitable market opportunities that enhanced the economic position of Alan communities. The agricultural experiments undertaken by settled Alan populations represented a fundamental departure from their nomadic traditions, as communities that had previously relied entirely on pastoralism began incorporating crop production into their economic activities. The fertile soils of the Loire Valley proved well suited to grain cultivation, while the region's climate allowed for longer growing seasons than the communities had experienced in their steppe homeland. Alan farmers, learning techniques from their Gallic neighbours, began producing surplus grain that could be traded for manufactured goods and luxury items that enhanced their community's prosperity and status. The gradual adoption of Christianity by Alan communities during this period reflected both practical considerations and genuine spiritual transformation, as traditional Iranian religious practices adapted to the dominant religious culture of their new homeland. The process proceeded unevenly, with some Alan families embracing Christian beliefs enthusiastically, while others maintained traditional fire worship and sky god veneration alongside nominal Christian observance. The construction of churches within Alan settlements typically incorporated architectural elements that reflected both Christian requirements and traditional Alan aesthetic preferences, creating distinctive hybrid structures that served the spiritual needs of culturally transitioning communities. The role of Christian missionaries in facilitating Alan integration into Gallic society extended beyond simple religious conversion to include education in Latin literacy, Roman legal concepts, and administrative procedures that enabled effective participation in post-Roman governmental structures. Missionaries like St. Germanus of Auxerre, who worked extensively with barbarian communities throughout central Gaul, recognised that successful evangelization required accommodation of existing cultural practices rather than their complete elimination. The Christian communities that emerged from this process retained distinctively Alan characteristics in their religious observances, architectural preferences, and social organisation while accepting fundamental Christian theological principles. The intermarriage patterns that developed between Alan settlers and local Gallic populations created kinship networks that strengthened the bonds between communities while facilitating cultural exchange in both directions. Alan nobles seeking to establish legitimacy within existing Gallic social hierarchies frequently married daughters of Roman senatorial families or prominent Gallic landowners, creating alliances that provided mutual benefits in terms of political influence and economic opportunity. These marriage relationships typically involved complex negotiations regarding property rights, religious observance, and the cultural identity of children, as both families sought to preserve essential elements of their traditions while adapting to their changed circumstances. The children of these mixed marriages often became crucial intermediaries between Alan and Gallic communities, possessing linguistic skills and cultural knowledge that enabled them to function effectively in both societies. Many rose to positions of leadership within their communities, serving as interpreters, negotiators, and administrators who could navigate the complex political and legal relationships that governed post-Roman Gaul. Their success in these roles demonstrated the practical advantages of cultural integration while preserving elements of Alan identity that remained valued by their communities. The expansion of Frankish power under Clovis during the late 5th and early 6th centuries created new challenges and opportunities for established Alan communities throughout Gaul. The Frankish military system, based on infantry formations supported by limited cavalry forces, initially viewed Alan heavy cavalry with suspicion as potential rivals for military dominance. However, the practical requirements of defending and expanding Frankish territory soon demonstrated the continued value of Alan military capabilities, leading to the integration of Alan units into Frankish armies under arrangements that preserved their tactical autonomy while ensuring their loyalty to Frankish leadership. The Battle of Vuil in 507 AD provided a crucial test of these new arrangements, as Frankish forces under Clovis confronted the Visigothic army of Alaric II for control of southwestern Gaul. Alan cavalry units, serving under Frankish command but maintaining their traditional equipment and tactical methods, played decisive roles in the preliminary skirmishing that disrupted Visigothic formations before the main infantry engagement. Their ability to strike rapidly at enemy flanks and rear areas, then withdraw before effective counterattacks could be organised, created the tactical conditions that enabled Frankish infantry to achieve victory in the subsequent close combat. The aftermath of Vuil saw significant changes in the status and territorial distribution of Alan communities throughout Gaul, as Frankish expansion brought new administrative arrangements that affected barbarian federative relationships. Communities that had demonstrated loyalty during the campaign received confirmation of their territorial rights and expanded autonomy in local affairs, while those suspected of insufficient commitment to Frankish objectives faced increased supervision and reduced privileges. The Alan settlements in the Loire Valley, which had provided substantial cavalry contingents for the Vuil campaign, received formal recognition as permanent Frankish allies with guaranteed settlement rights and continued military autonomy. The integration of Alan communities into Frankish territorial administration required adaptation of existing governmental structures to accommodate the dual nature of their status as both autonomous tribal groups and subjects of Frankish authority. Alan leaders retained traditional authority over their followers while accepting appointment as Frankish officials responsible for regional administration and military organisation. These arrangements created hybrid administrative systems that combined Frankish legal principles with Alan customary practices, enabling effective governance of mixed populations while preserving essential elements of tribal identity. The migration of significant Alan populations to the Iberian Peninsula represented a separate but related development that occurred simultaneously with their settlement in Gaul, as different tribal groups pursued varying strategies for adaptation to post-Hunnic political conditions. The Alan contingents that accompanied Vandal forces into Iberia in 409 AD had initially settled in the Lusitanian regions of modern Portugal, where they established communities similar to those developing in Gaul, while maintaining their military alliance with Vandal leadership. However, the subsequent Vandal migration to North Africa in 429 AD created new circumstances that forced Alan communities to develop independent relationships with other Iberian powers. The Visigothic conquest of most Iberian territories during the mid-5th century brought Alan communities under Gothic authority, requiring complex negotiations regarding their status and obligations within the emerging Visigothic kingdom. Unlike the situation in Gaul, where Alan communities had established direct relationships with Roman provincial authorities before Frankish expansion, the Iberian Alans found themselves dealing with Gothic leaders who possessed their own strong cavalry traditions and were less dependent on barbarian federati for military effectiveness. The resulting arrangements typically granted Alan communities limited autonomy in exchange for military service and tribute payments that reflected their subordinate status within the Gothic political hierarchy. The involvement of Iberian Alan communities in Visigothic politics during the 6th century demonstrated their continued military significance despite their reduced political autonomy. Alan cavalry units participated in Visigothic campaigns against Suebi resistance in northwestern Iberia, providing the mobility and striking power necessary for operations in the mountainous terrain of Galicia and northern Portugal. Their knowledge of mountain warfare, acquired during their earlier settlement in the Caucasus region, proved particularly valuable in these campaigns, as traditional Gothic heavy infantry tactics were poorly suited to the guerrilla warfare employed by Suebi defenders. The cultural assimilation processes affecting Iberian Alan communities proceeded along similar lines to those occurring in Gaul, though with important differences reflecting the distinct political and religious environment of the Visigothic kingdom. The Visigothic adherence to Arian Christianity created additional complications for Alan religious conversion, as communities needed to navigate between traditional Iranian beliefs, Catholic Christianity promoted by the Hispano-Roman population, and Arian Christianity favoured by their Gothic rulers. The religious compromises that emerged from this complex situation often involved the maintenance of traditional Alan practices within nominally Christian frameworks, creating syncretic religious systems that preserved essential elements of tribal identity while satisfying the requirements of political integration. The archaeological evidence from Iberian Alan settlement sites reveals material culture that reflects both continuity with steppe traditions and adaptation to Mediterranean environmental conditions, yet simultaneously, far to the east, other Alan groups were establishing what would become their most enduring territorial stronghold in the mountain valleys and highland plateaus of the North Caucasus. The geographic advantages of this region, defensible terrain, adequate pasture for livestock, strategic position controlling access between the steppes and the civilized world, attracted Alan communities seeking to preserve their cultural identity while building sustainable political structures that could withstand the continuing upheavals affecting the broader Eurasian world. The consolidation of Alan power in the North Caucasus began during the late 4th century as refugee populations from the Hunnic expansion sought secure territories where they could re-establish their traditional social and economic systems. The Terek River Valley, with its network of tributary streams descending from the central Caucasus peaks, provided an ideal environment for communities accustomed to the seasonal migration patterns that had characterized steppe pastoralism. The valley floors offered rich grasslands suitable for horse and cattle grazing, while the surrounding mountain slopes provided summer pastures that could support large herds during the warmer months when lowland vegetation became sparse. The initial settlement patterns established during this period reflected careful consideration of both defensive requirements and economic necessities. Alan communities positioned their primary settlements on elevated terraces overlooking major river valleys, locations that provided natural defensive advantages while maintaining access to water sources and agricultural land. The village of Zmaiskaya, established in the central Terek Valley during the early 5th century, exemplifies these strategic considerations through its placement on a prominent bluff that commanded views of the surrounding countryside while remaining accessible to the valley floor where livestock could graze and crops could be cultivated. Archaeological investigations at Zmaiskaya have revealed architectural innovations that adapted traditional Alan building techniques to the requirements of permanent settlement in mountainous terrain. The residential structures, constructed with stone foundations supporting timber-framed walls, filled with clay and rubble, represented a significant departure from the portable dwellings that had characterized nomadic life on the steppes. These buildings, measuring typically 8 to 12 meters in length and 4 to 6 meters in width, could accommodate extended families while providing storage space for grain, tools, and other materials essential for sedentary life. The roofing systems, constructed with wooden beams supporting layers of stone slabs covered with clay and organic materials, were designed to withstand the heavy snows and severe weather conditions characteristic of highland winters. The defensive works constructed around these early settlements demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mountain warfare principles that would influence Caucasian military architecture for centuries. The fortification system at Zmeiskaya consisted of multiple defensive lines that took advantage of natural terrain features while providing overlapping fields of fire for defenders armed with composite bows. The outer perimeter, marked by stone walls averaging 2 meters in height and reinforced with wooden palisades, enclosed an area of approximately 15 hectares that could accommodate the entire community during periods of external threat. Interior defensive positions, built around the most important residential and storage structures, provided fallback positions that could be held by small numbers of defenders even if the outer walls were breached. The gradual transition from purely nomadic pastoralism to mixed agricultural and pastoral economy represented one of the most significant adaptations made by Caucasian Alan communities during the 5th and 6th centuries. The fertile valley floors of the Terek and its tributaries proved well suited to grain cultivation, particularly barley and wheat varieties that could mature during the relatively short growing seasons characteristic of highland environments. Alan farmers, learning techniques from neighbouring Caucasian peoples, developed agricultural methods that maximised crop yields while maintaining the flexibility necessary for continued livestock management. The field systems established during this period featured terraced plots that prevented soil erosion on sloped terrain, while providing adequate drainage during periods of heavy rainfall or snowmelt. The integration of agricultural production with traditional pastoral activities required careful coordination of land use patterns that could accommodate both crops and livestock without creating conflicts over scarce resources. Alan communities developed seasonal rotation systems that allowed fields to be used for crop production during growing seasons while providing grazing areas for livestock during fallow periods. These arrangements required sophisticated understanding of soil fertility, plant growth cycles, and animal nutrition that represented significant expansion of traditional nomadic knowledge systems. The storage facilities constructed for agricultural surplus, including underground granaries carved into bedrock and above-ground structures built with stone walls and timber roofing, enabled communities to maintain food security during harsh winters when both crop production and livestock productivity declined significantly. The establishment of fortified settlements throughout the North Caucasus region proceeded systematically during the 6th and 7th centuries, as Alan leaders recognized the strategic value of controlling key geographic positions that commanded access routes between the steppes and the civilized territories to the south. The fortress complex at Verkhny Djulat, constructed on a prominent ridge overlooking the confluence of the Terek and Sunja rivers, exemplifies the sophisticated military engineering that characterized this expansion phase. The site's natural advantages, including steep approaches on 3 sides and commanding views of the surrounding valley system, were enhanced through extensive artificial modifications that created one of the most formidable defensive positions in the entire Caucasus region. The fortification system at Verkhny Djulat incorporated multiple defensive elements that reflected both traditional steppe military concepts and innovations adapted from contact with Byzantine and Persian fortress architecture. The main defensive wall, constructed with carefully fitted stone blocks and rising to heights exceeding 4 meters, featured projecting towers at regular intervals that provided flanking fire against attackers attempting to scale the walls. The gate system, protected by overlapping defensive works that forced approaching enemies to expose their flanks to defensive fire, incorporated architectural elements clearly influenced by Byzantine military engineering, while maintaining proportions and design features characteristic of Alan aesthetic preferences. Interior structures within the fortress included barracks facilities for permanent garrisons, workshops for weapons and equipment maintenance, and storage areas capable of supporting extended sieges. The development of these fortified positions required significant investment in specialized construction techniques and materials that exceeded the capabilities of individual tribal groups. The organization of labor forces capable of quarrying stone, transporting materials across difficult mountain terrain, and executing complex engineering projects necessitated coordination between multiple Alan communities under centralized leadership structures. The emergence of regional princes capable of directing these construction projects represented a fundamental evolution in Alan political organization, as traditional tribal leadership gave way to more hierarchical systems that could manage the administrative and logistical requirements of territorial control. The conversion of Alan communities to Christianity during the 7th and 8th centuries occurred through multiple channels that reflected the complex religious and political environment of the Caucasus region during this period. Byzantine missionary efforts, coordinated through the Patriarch of Constantinople and supported by imperial diplomatic initiatives, targeted Alan leadership groups as potential allies against Persian and later Arab expansion into the region. The initial Christian missions, led by clergy fluent in Greek and familiar with barbarian customs, emphasized the political advantages of Christian conversion, while accommodating traditional Alan religious practices that did not directly conflict with Christian theology. The syncretic religious systems that emerged from these efforts preserved elements of traditional fire worship and ancestor veneration within Christian frameworks that satisfied both missionary requirements and tribal spiritual needs. Georgian missionary activities among the Alan communities proceeded along different lines that reflected the distinct theological and political traditions of the Georgian Church. Georgian clergy, operating from monasteries established in the southern Caucasus valleys, emphasized the ascetic and mystical aspects of Christian practice that resonated with traditional Alan spiritual concepts. The monastic communities established by these missions, including the important foundation at Arches in the upper Kuban Valley, served as centers for Christian education and cultural exchange that facilitated the gradual integration of Alan communities into the broader Christian world. The architectural remains of these early churches, featuring distinctive Georgian design elements adapted to local building materials and construction techniques, provide tangible evidence of the cultural synthesis that characterized this conversion process. The archaeological evidence for Christian conversion among Alan communities includes numerous church foundations dating to the 8th and 9th centuries that demonstrate the gradual adoption of Christian architectural and artistic traditions. The church complex at Nizhny Arches, constructed during the early 9th century, exemplifies the sophisticated ecclesiastical architecture that developed in Alan territories during this period. The main church building, constructed with carefully dressed sandstone blocks and featuring a cruciform plan typical of Byzantine church architecture, incorporated decorative elements that reflected both Christian iconographic traditions and traditional Alan artistic motifs. The interior decorations, including frescoes depicting Christian saints alongside geometric patterns characteristic of steppe artistic traditions, demonstrate the syncretic nature of Alan Christian culture during this formative period. The burial practices evidenced in Alan cemeteries from the Christian period reveal the gradual transformation of traditional funeral customs as communities adapted to Christian theological requirements while preserving elements of ancestral religious traditions. The cemetery at Mokraya Balka, which remained in continuous use from the 8th through the 12th centuries, shows clear evolution from traditional Alan burial practices toward Christian customs over this extended period. Early burials from the site feature traditional grave goods, including weapons, horse equipment, and personal ornaments arranged according to ancient Iranian religious concepts about the afterlife journey. Later burials show reduced grave goods and orientation patterns consistent with Christian practice, though many retain distinctive elements that reflect continued adherence to traditional beliefs about death and spiritual continuation. The political relationships that developed between Alan principalities and neighbouring powers during the 8th and 9th centuries required sophisticated diplomatic capabilities that drew upon both traditional steppe political concepts and new approaches adapted to the complex international environment of the medieval Caucasus. The Khazar Khaganate, which controlled territories immediately to the north and east of Alan settlements, represented both a potential threat and a valuable commercial partner whose policies significantly affected Alan economic and political development. The tributary relationships established between certain Alan groups and Khazar leadership provided protection against external threats, while granting access to the extensive trade networks that connected the Khazar territories with Constantinople, Baghdad, and the commercial centres of Central Asia. The diplomatic protocols governing Alan-Khazar relations reflected the pragmatic approach characteristic of steppe political traditions, emphasising mutual benefit rather than ideological compatibility. Alan communities that accepted Khazar suzerainty retained internal autonomy in religious and cultural affairs while providing military service and tribute payments according to negotiated agreements. These arrangements typically included provisions for commercial cooperation, with Alan merchants receiving protection and trading privileges within Khazar territories in exchange for facilitating trade relationships between the Khaganate and the Byzantine Empire. The material benefits flowing from these relationships included access to luxury goods, advanced technologies, and military equipment that enhanced the prosperity and defensive capabilities of participating Alan communities. The Byzantine Empire's strategic interest in Alan territories stemmed from their crucial position controlling access routes between the steppe world and the imperial frontiers in Anatolia and the Caucasus. Byzantine diplomatic initiatives during the 8th and 9th centuries sought to establish alliance relationships that would provide early warning of nomadic movements, while creating buffer zones that could absorb the initial impact of steppe invasions. The formal diplomatic agreements negotiated between Constantinople and various Alaean leaders included provisions for military cooperation, commercial privileges, and religious support that created mutual dependencies beneficial to both parties. The imperial subsidies provided to Alan leaders, including annual payments of gold solidi and luxury manufactured goods, enabled recipient communities to maintain military capabilities while pursuing economic development projects that strengthened their territorial control. The emergence of Georgian principalities as significant regional powers during the 9th and 10th centuries created new diplomatic opportunities and challenges for Alan communities seeking to balance their relationships with multiple neighbouring states. The Georgian kingdoms of Kartli and Kakheti, which controlled territories immediately south of the main Caucasus ridge, shared common interests with Alan groups in resisting Arab expansion while maintaining commercial relationships with both Byzantine and Islamic territories. The alliance relationships that developed between Georgian and Alan leaders typically involved military cooperation agreements that provided mutual defence against external threats, while establishing frameworks for commercial and cultural exchange. These relationships were frequently cemented through marriage alliances between ruling families that created kinship networks spanning the entire Caucasus region. The military cooperation between Alan and Georgian forces proved particularly effective in mountain warfare environments where traditional heavy cavalry tactics required modification for operations in difficult terrain. Alan cavalry units, with their superior mobility and archery capabilities, provided reconnaissance and harassment functions that complemented Georgian infantry formations trained for defensive operations in fortified positions. The combined tactical systems that emerged from this cooperation influenced military development throughout the Caucasus region, establishing precedents for the integrated defensive strategies that would characterize medieval Caucasian warfare. The weapons and equipment produced for these joint operations showed clear technological exchange, with Georgian metallurgical techniques being applied to traditional Alan weapon designs, while Alan horse equipment influenced Georgian cavalry development. The commercial networks that connected Alan territories with the broader medieval world economy expanded significantly during the 9th and 10th centuries as political stability enabled increased trade volume and geographic reach. The position of Alan settlements astride traditional routes connecting the Black Sea coast with the Caspian region made them natural intermediaries for long-distance commerce that carried goods between the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and the emerging commercial centres of medieval Russia. Alan merchants, drawing upon traditional nomadic knowledge of trade routes and commercial practices, established trading relationships that extended from Constantinople to Bukhara, while maintaining local commercial networks that served the needs of Caucasian communities. The goods flowing through these commercial networks included luxury items, raw materials, and manufactured products that reflected the diverse economic systems connected by medieval trade routes. Byzantine silk, glassware, and precious metalwork moved northward through Alan territories toward the markets of Kiev and Novgorod, while furs, honey, and slaves from the northern forests travelled southward toward Constantinople and the Islamic commercial centres. The Alan communities profited from this transit trade through taxation, direct participation in commercial ventures, and the provision of transport and security services that enabled long-distance commerce to function effectively despite the political fragmentation that characterized the medieval world. The craft production that developed within Alan settlements during this period reflected both traditional skills adapted to new markets and innovative techniques learned through contact with neighbouring civilizations. Yet by the 10th century, these scattered highland communities had begun coalescing into a more centralized political entity that would become known to medieval chroniclers as the Kingdom of Alania. The transformation from loosely affiliated tribal settlements to a unified kingdom represented the culmination of centuries of political evolution, as Alan leaders recognized that coordinated governance could provide superior defense against external threats while maximizing the economic benefits of their strategic geographic position. The consolidation of Alan political authority centred on the establishment of Magas as the primary royal residence and administrative centre of the emerging kingdom. Located in the Argun Valley of modern Ingushetia, Magas occupied a naturally defensible position that commanded views of multiple river valleys, while remaining accessible to the network of mountain passes that connected different regions of Alan territory. The site's elevation of nearly 1,500 metres above sea level provided natural protection against surprise attacks while offering clear lines of sight that enabled defenders to observe approaching enemies from distances exceeding 20 kilometres. The fortification system constructed at Magas during the late 10th and early 11th centuries represented the pinnacle of medieval Caucasian military architecture, incorporating lessons learned from centuries of mountain warfare while adapting techniques borrowed from Byzantine and Georgian fortress design. The main defensive wall, constructed with precisely fitted limestone blocks quarried from nearby mountain slopes, rose to heights of 6 metres and featured a thickness of nearly 3 metres at its base. The wall's construction technique, employing alternating courses of large foundation stones and smaller fill material bonded with lime mortar, created structures capable of withstanding both siege engines and seismic activity common in the tectonically active Caucasus region. The defensive towers that punctuated the main wall at intervals of approximately 40 metres demonstrated sophisticated understanding of medieval siege warfare principles. These structures, rising to heights of 12 to 15 metres, featured multiple levels that could accommodate different types of defensive weapons, while providing protected positions for archers and crossbowmen. The tower design incorporated Byzantine architectural elements, including distinctive corbelled battlements and arrow slits, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, while maintaining proportions and decorative details that reflected traditional Alan aesthetic preferences. The ground floors of these towers served as storage areas for weapons and supplies, while upper levels provided living quarters for garrison personnel and observation posts for monitoring the surrounding countryside. The royal palace complex within the fortress demonstrated the sophisticated court culture that had developed among Alan nobility by the 11th century. The main audience hall, measuring approximately 30 metres in length and 15 metres in width, featured stone columns supporting a timber roof structure, decorated with carved beams that displayed intricate geometric patterns characteristic of Caucasian artistic traditions. The floor, constructed with carefully fitted stone slabs arranged in complex geometric designs, incorporated heating systems that channeled warm air through underground passages, enabling comfortable occupation during harsh mountain winters. Wall decorations included both Christian religious imagery and traditional Alan motifs, reflecting the syncretic cultural identity that characterised the medieval Alanian court. The administrative buildings surrounding the palace complex housed the bureaucratic apparatus necessary for governing a kingdom that controlled territories spanning from the Kuban River in the west to the Terek Valley in the east. These structures included archives for storing legal documents and diplomatic correspondence, workshops for producing official seals and ceremonial objects, and residential quarters for court officials and visiting dignitaries. The architectural style of these buildings combined functional requirements with symbolic elements that reinforced royal authority, featuring carved stone decorations that depicted scenes of royal hunts, military victories, and religious ceremonies that legitimized Alan political power through both secular and sacred imagery. The development of a sophisticated legal system represented one of the most significant achievements of the medieval Iranian kingdom, as traditional tribal customs were codified and systematized to create coherent governmental structures capable of managing complex territorial administration. The legal code that emerged during this period, preserved in fragmentary form in Georgian and Armenian chronicles, combined elements of traditional Alan customary law with principles borrowed from Byzantine legal traditions and Christian canonical law. This hybrid legal system addressed issues ranging from property rights and commercial disputes to criminal justice and military obligations, creating comprehensive frameworks for social organisation that could accommodate both traditional tribal communities and the more complex urban settlements that were developing around major fortresses. The economic foundation of the medieval Alanian kingdom rested on systematic control of the mountain passes that connected the North Caucasus steppes with the commercial centres of Georgia and Armenia to the south. The Darial Pass, known to medieval sources as the Gate of the Alans, represented the most important of these routes, as it provided the primary pathway for trade between the Byzantine Empire and the emerging commercial centres of medieval Russia. The fortress complex constructed to control this pass during the 11th century featured multiple defensive positions that could halt unauthorized traffic while providing secure facilities for legitimate merchants to rest and resupply during their dangerous mountain journeys. The taxation system implemented for transit trade through Alan-controlled passes generated substantial revenues that funded the military forces and administrative apparatus necessary for maintaining territorial control. The toll schedules, negotiated through diplomatic agreements with major trading partners, typically required payment of approximately 5% of cargo value for safe passage through Alan territory. These arrangements included provisions for currency exchange, as merchants travelling between different monetary systems could convert Byzantine gold solidi, Islamic silver dirhams, and various regional coinages at standardized rates that prevented exploitation while ensuring fair compensation for Alan services. The revenues generated through these commercial activities enabled Alan rulers to maintain professional military forces, construct and maintain fortifications, and support the court culture that legitimised their political authority. The agricultural development that accompanied political centralisation transformed the economic base of Alan society from primarily pastoral activities to diversified production systems that could support larger populations while maintaining traditional livestock management. The terraced field systems, constructed in river valleys throughout Alan territory during the 11th and 12th centuries, represented sophisticated adaptations of Mediterranean agricultural techniques to highland environmental conditions. These terraces, built with stone-retaining walls that prevented soil erosion while maximising arable land area, enabled cultivation of wheat, barley and millet varieties that provided dietary staples for both urban and rural populations. The irrigation systems that supplied these agricultural areas featured carefully engineered channels that diverted water from mountain streams while incorporating overflow mechanisms that prevented flood damage during periods of heavy rainfall or rapid snowmelt. The livestock management practices that continued alongside agricultural development maintained the horse breeding capabilities that had always formed the foundation of Alan military power. The highland pastures of the central Caucasus proved ideal for raising the large, sturdy horses required for heavy cavalry operations, as the challenging terrain and harsh climate produced animals with exceptional endurance and sure-footedness. The breeding programs developed during the medieval period emphasise characteristics that enhanced military effectiveness, including size sufficient to carry armoured riders, temperament suitable for battlefield conditions, and intelligence necessary for the complex manoeuvres required in mountain warfare. The quality of Alan horses became legendary throughout the medieval world, with contemporary sources describing them as superior to the mounts available in most other regions. The metalworking industry that developed around major Alan settlements during the 11th and 12th centuries produced weapons and armour that combined traditional steppe designs with technological innovations learned through contact with Byzantine and Islamic craftsmen. The workshops at Magas and other fortress cities employed specialised techniques for producing the scale armour that remained the preferred protection for Alan heavy cavalry. These armour systems, constructed from thousands of small iron plates sewn onto leather backing with silk thread, required months of skilled labour to complete, while providing flexible protection that allowed mounted warriors to fight effectively for extended periods. The individual scales, typically measuring 3 centimetres in length and 2 centimetres in width, were carefully shaped and hardened to specific standards that ensured uniform protection while maintaining the flexibility essential for mounted combat. The weapons produced in Alan workshops during this period demonstrated remarkable technical sophistication, particularly in the production of composite bows that represented the pinnacle of medieval projectile weapon technology. These bows, constructed from horn strips laminated to wooden cores and backed with carefully prepared sinew, required specialised knowledge and materials that were available only to the most skilled craftsmen. The manufacturing process involved precise selection of materials based on seasonal availability and quality standards, careful seasoning of components over periods extending up to 2 years, and assembly techniques that required intimate understanding of wood grain, horn structure, and sinew preparation. The finished weapons could drive arrows through mail armour at ranges exceeding 300 metres, while maintaining accuracy sufficient for battlefield use. The cultural achievements of the medieval Alanian kingdom included the development of sophisticated oral literary traditions that preserved historical memories while creating new artistic expressions adapted to the requirements of court culture. The epic poetry that emerged during this period, performed by professional bards at royal ceremonies and noble gatherings, combined traditional steppe heroic themes with Christian religious concepts and courtly romance motifs borrowed from Byzantine and Georgian literary traditions. These epic cycles, which included stories of heroic ancestors, legendary battles, and supernatural adventures, served both entertainment and educational functions by transmitting cultural values and historical knowledge to audiences that remained largely illiterate, despite increasing exposure to written culture. The architectural achievements of the medieval period extended beyond military fortifications to include religious buildings that demonstrated the sophisticated artistic capabilities of Allan craftsmen. The cathedral church constructed at Magus during the early 12th century exemplified the distinctive ecclesiastical architecture that developed in Allan territories during this period. The building's cruciform plan followed Byzantine architectural traditions while incorporating structural innovations adapted to local seismic conditions and building materials. The stone carving that decorated the exterior facades combined Christian iconographic elements with traditional Allan artistic motifs, creating decorative programs that reflected the syncretic religious culture of the medieval Alanian court. Interior decorations included frescoes depicting Christian saints alongside portraits of Allan rulers and nobles, demonstrating the integration of religious and secular authority that characterized medieval Alanian political culture. The diplomatic relationships maintained by the medieval Alanian kingdom reflected the complex international environment of the 11th and 12th centuries, as Allan rulers sought to balance competing pressures from Byzantine, Georgian, and emerging Russian powers while maintaining their territorial independence. The marriage alliance negotiated between the Alanian royal family and the Georgian Bagratid dynasty during the early 12th century created kinship relationships that provided mutual military support while facilitating commercial and cultural exchange. These diplomatic marriages typically involved complex negotiations regarding religious practices, inheritance rights, and political obligations that required careful balance between different legal and cultural traditions. The military organisation that supported Alanian independence during this period featured professional cavalry units that maintained traditional steppe fighting methods while incorporating new tactical concepts adapted to medieval warfare conditions. The Royal Guard, consisting of approximately 500 heavily armoured cavalry, formed the core of Alanian military power and served as a model for regional noble retinues throughout the kingdom. These warriors wore complete scale armour that covered their torsos, arms and thighs, while leaving their lower legs protected only by leather boots reinforced with metal plates. Their horses wore partial barding that protected the animal's chest and flanks without restricting mobility, while elaborate harness decorations displayed the wealth and status of their riders. The weapons carried by these elite cavalry included long lances for shot combat, composite bows for skirmishing, and curved sabres for close-quarters fighting, creating versatile capabilities that could adapt to different tactical situations. The defensive strategies employed by Allan military commanders during the 12th and 13th centuries demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the geographic advantages provided by mountain terrain while adapting to the changing nature of medieval warfare. The network of fortified positions constructed throughout Allan territory created overlapping defensive zones that could channel invading forces into predetermined killing grounds while providing secure bases for counterattack operations. These fortifications were positioned to control key river valleys and mountain passes while maintaining communication links that enabled coordinated responses to threats from multiple directions. The signal systems that connected these defensive positions employed beacon fires, horn calls, and mounted messengers to transmit information across distances of up to 50 kilometers, enabling rapid concentration of forces at threatened points. The resistance to Mongol expansion during the early 13th century represented the greatest military challenge faced by the medieval Alanian kingdom, as the highly organised and technologically advanced Mongol armies possessed capabilities that exceeded those of any previous enemy encountered by Allan forces. The initial Mongol reconnaissance expeditions that probed Alan defences during the 1220s reveal the systematic approach that characterised Mongol military operations, as small cavalry units mapped defensive positions and identified potential weaknesses while avoiding major engagements that might alert defenders to the scale of the impending threat. The intelligence gathered during these operations enabled Mongol commanders to develop comprehensive assault plans that could neutralise Alan defensive advantages while exploiting weaknesses in their military organisation. The siege of Magasse during the winter of 1238 to 1239 demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of medieval Alanian defensive capabilities when confronted with the sophisticated siege warfare techniques employed by Mongol armies. The fortress's natural defensive advantages, enhanced by centuries of architectural improvements, initially proved effective against Mongol assault attempts, as the steep approaches and massive stone walls prevented direct attacks, while the garrison's composite bows inflicted heavy casualties on besieging forces. However, the Mongol employment of Chinese siege engineers and advanced siege equipment, including counterweight trebuchets and gunpowder weapons, gradually overcame these defensive advantages through systematic destruction of wall sections and defensive towers. The final assault, launched after months of siege operations had weakened both the fortifications and the defending garrison, resulted in the capture of the fortress and the effective end of organised Alanian resistance to Mongol conquest. The final assault, launched after months of siege operations, had weakened both the fortifications and the defending garrison, resulted in the capture of the fortress and the effective end of organised Alanian resistance to Mongol conquest. The systematic destruction that followed the fall of Magasse exceeded even the thoroughness that had characterised earlier Mongol campaigns against sedentary civilizations, as the conquerors recognised that the mountain strongholds of the Caucasus could serve as bases for prolonged resistance if left intact. Mongol engineers, working under the direction of Chinese specialists who had perfected siege techniques during campaigns in northern China, methodically demolished the stone walls that had protected the Alanian capital for over 2 centuries. The limestone blocks that had been so carefully fitted by Alan masons were pried apart and scattered, while the defensive towers were undermined and brought down through controlled collapses that left only rubble-filled foundations to mark their former positions. The immediate aftermath of Magas's destruction created a humanitarian crisis throughout the North Caucasus, as thousands of refugees fled from the advancing Mongol columns into the high mountain valleys that offered temporary sanctuary from the systematic devastation being inflicted on lowland settlements. Archaeological evidence from hastily constructed refugee camps in the Upper Terek and Argun valleys reveals the desperate conditions faced by displaced populations during the harsh winter of 1239 to 1240. Temporary shelters, built from salvage materials and whatever stone and timber could be gathered in the high mountains, provided minimal protection against temperatures that regularly dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. The remains of these emergency settlements show clear evidence of severe malnutrition and disease, with skeletal material indicating mortality rates approaching 30% among the elderly and very young during the first winter of displacement. The Mongol military system that accomplished this devastating conquest represented the culmination of steppe warfare evolution, incorporating technological innovations and organisational methods that gave Mongol armies decisive advantages over traditional medieval military forces. The composite bows employed by Mongol cavalry featured advanced construction techniques that utilised horn plates from water buffalo and yak, materials that provided superior elasticity and power compared to the deer and elk horn traditionally used in European steppe regions. These weapons, manufactured in specialised workshops under strict quality control standards, could penetrate mail armour at ranges exceeding 350 metres while maintaining sufficient accuracy for battlefield use. The standardisation of arrow production enabled Mongol forces to maintain high rates of fire during extended engagements, as each warrior carried between 60 and 80 arrows in specialized quivers designed for rapid access during mounted combat. The organizational structure of Mongol armies eliminated many of the coordination problems that had plagued earlier steppe confederations through the implementation of decimal command systems that created clear hierarchies from squad to army level. Each unit of 10 warriors operated under a designated leader who maintained direct communication with higher command levels through an elaborate system of signals, messengers, and pre-arranged tactical procedures. This organizational method enabled Mongol commanders to coordinate complex maneuvers involving tens of thousands of cavalry across battlefield frontages, extending for dozens of kilometers, capabilities that no previous nomadic confederation had possessed. The discipline required for these tactical systems was maintained through harsh punishment codes that eliminated individual initiative in favor of absolute obedience to command directives. The siege warfare capabilities that proved so decisive against Iranian fortifications represented a fundamental departure from traditional nomadic military methods, as Mongol armies incorporated specialized engineering units recruited from conquered Chinese and Persian territories. These engineers brought knowledge of counterweight trebuchets, torsion artillery, and early gunpowder weapons that could breach stone fortifications previously considered impregnable. The trebuchets employed during the siege of Magas could hurl stone projectiles weighing up to 140 kilograms over distances exceeding 300 meters, creating impact forces sufficient to shatter limestone walls that were over 3 meters thick. The psychological effect of these weapons proved as important as their physical destructive capability, as defending garrisons had no experience with artillery systems that could strike targets within fortress walls from positions beyond the range of defensive archery. The intelligence networks that supported Mongol military operations provided commanders with detailed information about enemy capabilities, defensive positions, and potential escape routes that enabled the systematic elimination of resistance centers throughout the North Caucasus. Mongol scouts, often recruited from local populations through a combination of coercion and financial incentives, mapped mountain passes, identified water sources, and located hidden settlements that might serve as refugee sanctuaries. This intelligence was compiled into comprehensive operational plans that allocated specific objectives to different Mongol units while ensuring that escape routes were blocked and potential rallying points were neutralized before they could become centers of organized resistance. The population displacement that resulted from these military operations affected approximately 200,000 people throughout the Greater Caucasus region, creating migration streams that would reshape the demographic composition of the entire area for centuries. The mountain valleys that had previously supported relatively small populations of seasonal herders suddenly found themselves hosting thousands of refugees who lacked the specialized knowledge necessary for survival in high-altitude environments. The competition for limited resources in these mountain sanctuaries created conflicts between different refugee groups, as traditional tribal rivalries were exacerbated by the desperate circumstances of displacement and the breakdown of established social hierarchies that had previously maintained order within Alan communities. The adaptation strategies developed by surviving Alan communities during this crisis period demonstrated remarkable resilience and cultural flexibility as traditional steppe social structures evolved to meet the requirements of permanent mountain settlement. The clan-based organisation that had characterised earlier Alan society proved particularly well suited to the challenges of refugee life, as extended family groups could pool resources and coordinate survival efforts more effectively than larger political units that required extensive administrative apparatus. The leadership roles that emerged during this period often went to individuals who possessed practical skills essential for mountain survival, rather than those who'd held traditional positions of authority in the pre-conquest political hierarchy. The religious practices that sustained Alan communities during this traumatic period combined traditional Iranian spiritual concepts with Christian beliefs in ways that provided psychological comfort while maintaining cultural identity under extreme stress. The fire worship that had formed the core of pre-Christian Alan religious practice experienced a revival during the displacement period as communities lacking access to established churches turned to older spiritual traditions that required minimal infrastructure and could be practiced in temporary mountain shelters. These sacred fires maintained by refugee communities served both practical and spiritual functions, providing essential warmth during harsh mountain winters while creating focal points for communal activities that reinforced group solidarity and cultural continuity. The preservation of oral traditions became a crucial cultural survival strategy as displaced Alan communities recognized that their historical knowledge and epic literature might be lost if not actively maintained during the disruption caused by conquest and displacement. Professional bards, who had previously performed primarily for noble audiences at court ceremonies, adapted their repertoires to address the experiences of refugee communities while preserving the traditional epic cycles that contained essential cultural knowledge. These performances, conducted around evening fires in temporary mountain settlements, served educational functions by transmitting survival skills and cultural values to younger generations who had no direct experience of traditional Alan society. The epic narratives that emerged from this period incorporated new themes related to resistance against foreign conquest and the preservation of cultural identity under adverse conditions. The material culture that developed in mountain refugee settlements reflected both the constraints imposed by limited resources and the adaptive capabilities of Alan craftsmen who modified traditional techniques to work with locally available materials. The metalworking that had been a hallmark of Alan civilization continued on a reduced scale in mountain workshops that utilized iron ore deposits found in highland regions, though the quality and quantity of production declined significantly due to limited access to fuel and specialized tools. The weapons produced in these mountain forges showed clear adaptations to the requirements of guerrilla warfare, with emphasis on lightweight designs that could be easily concealed and transported during rapid movement between mountain positions. The distinctive curved sabres that became characteristic of later Caucasian warfare traditions emerged during this period, as Alan smiths developed blade designs optimized for close-quarters combat in confined mountain terrain. The agricultural adaptations required for survival in high-altitude environments forced Alan communities to abandon many traditional farming practices in favour of techniques better suited to short growing seasons and steep terrain. The terraced field systems that had been developed in river valleys during the medieval period were modified for construction on mountain slopes where level ground was scarce and soil depth was limited. These high-altitude terraces, built with dry stone walls that could withstand freeze-thaw cycles, enabled cultivation of hardy grain varieties that could mature during the brief summer seasons, available at elevations exceeding 2,000 metres above sea level. The crop selection process emphasised barley and oat varieties that had been traditionally grown as animal fodder but could provide human nutrition when other food sources were unavailable. The livestock management practices that sustained mountain communities during the displacement period required significant modifications to traditional pastoral techniques as herders adapted to environments where pasture quality was lower and seasonal migration patterns were restricted by security concerns. The horse herds that had been the foundation of Alan military power were reduced to small numbers of animals that could be hidden in remote mountain valleys and moved quickly when Mongol patrols threatened their security. The emphasis shifted towards sheep and goat herds that were better adapted to steep terrain and sparse vegetation, while providing essential protein, dairy products, and raw materials for clothing and shelter construction. The breeding programs that had produced the large cavalry mounts prized throughout the medieval world, were abandoned in favour of smaller, more hardy animals that could survive on limited fodder while remaining useful for transportation and occasional military service. The gradual establishment of permanent settlements in the high Caucasus valleys proceeded slowly during the late 13th and early 14th centuries as refugee communities developed the specialised knowledge necessary for long-term survival in mountain environments. The village sites selected during this period typically occupied elevated positions that provided natural defensive advantages while maintaining access to water sources and areas suitable for limited agricultural production. The architectural styles that emerged in these permanent settlements combined traditional Allan building techniques with innovations adapted to the specific challenges of high-altitude construction, including methods for creating stable foundations on steep slopes and roofing systems designed to shed heavy snow loads without collapse. The defensive works constructed around these mountain settlements reflected hard-learned lessons about the requirements for protection against both Mongol military forces and the bandit groups that proliferated throughout the region during the breakdown of established governmental authority. The fortification systems typically consisted of multiple defensive lines that took advantage of natural terrain features while providing positions for small numbers of defenders to hold off much larger attacking forces. The construction techniques employed for these defences emphasised the use of local stone materials arranged in drywall systems that could be quickly repaired after damage and did not require specialised masonry skills or imported materials. The defensive positions were designed to be abandoned quickly if overwhelmed, with pre-planned escape routes leading to higher elevations where pursuing forces would face even greater disadvantages. The emergence of regional warlords during the 14th century created new political structures that gradually replaced the centralised kingdom that had been destroyed by Mongol conquest. These local leaders, typically drawn from families that had maintained some military capability during the displacement period, established control over specific mountain valleys or groups of settlements through a combination of military force and negotiated agreements with community leaders. The authority exercised by these warlords was generally more limited than that of the medieval Iranian kings, focusing primarily on military leadership and external relations while allowing individual communities to maintain traditional forms of internal governance. The tribute systems that supported these local rulers were necessarily modest, as the mountain communities possessed limited surplus production and couldn't sustain the elaborate court culture that had characterized the pre-conquest kingdom. The gradual adaptation to Mongol administrative systems occurred unevenly throughout Allan territories as different communities developed varying relationships with the conquerors based on their geographic position and strategic value. The communities that controlled important mountain passes or possessed specialised skills useful to Mongol administration often negotiated tributary arrangements that provided a degree of autonomy in exchange for regular payments and military service. These agreements typically required the provision of scouts and guides who possessed intimate knowledge of mountain terrain, capabilities that proved valuable to Mongol forces conducting operations against other resistant populations throughout the Caucasus region. The Allan warriors who entered Mongol service during this period maintained their traditional fighting methods and equipment, while accepting integration into the decimal organisational system that characterised Mongol military structure. The cultural preservation efforts that sustained Allan identity during this period of political fragmentation centred on the maintenance of traditional epic poetry and oral historical traditions that contained essential knowledge about pre-conquest society and cultural values. The professional bards who had survived the initial conquest period adapted their performance practices to the changed circumstances of mountain life, developing new venues and audiences for their traditional repertoires. The evening gatherings that became standard features of mountain village life provided regular opportunities for the recitation of epic cycles that preserved historical memories while entertaining communities that had limited access to other forms of cultural expression. These performances served educational functions by transmitting cultural knowledge to younger generations while maintaining the linguistic traditions that distinguished Alan communities from their neighbours. The religious syncretism that characterised Alan's spiritual life during this period reflected both the practical constraints of mountain existence and the psychological needs of communities struggling to maintain cultural identity under foreign domination. The Christian practices that had been adopted during the medieval period continued in modified forms that could be maintained without formal church structures or regular access to ordained clergy. The traditional fire worship that had never been completely abandoned experienced a revival as communities turned to spiritual practices that could provide comfort and cultural continuity without requiring external institutional support. The seasonal festivals that marked important points in the agricultural and pastoral calendar incorporated elements from both Christian and pre-Christian traditions, creating syncretic celebrations that reinforce community solidarity while preserving essential cultural knowledge. The gradual recovery that began during the late 14th century proceeded slowly as Alan communities developed sustainable economic and political systems adapted to their mountain environment while maintaining sufficient military capability to defend against external threats. This recovery period would prove crucial for the cultural and linguistic continuity that would eventually give birth to the modern Ossetian people, who represent the most direct descendants of the ancient Alan Confederation. The transformation from medieval Alanian principalities to early modern Ossetian communities occurred through centuries of adaptation, consolidation, and cultural preservation that maintained essential elements of Alan identity, while accommodating the changing political landscape of the Caucasus region. The linguistic evolution that produced modern Ossetian from medieval Alan dialects demonstrates remarkable continuity, despite the traumatic disruptions of the Mongol period and subsequent political upheavals. The Ossetian language, divided into two primary dialects, Ain in the south and Digor in the northwest, preserves archaic Iranian features that disappeared from other Eastern Iranian languages centuries ago. The Ain dialect, spoken by approximately 450,000 people in North Ossetia Alania and South Ossetia, maintains grammatical structures and vocabulary that can be directly traced to Alan linguistic forms recorded in medieval sources. The preservation of the ancient Iranian case system, with 7 distinct cases including an instrumental case rarely found in other Iranian languages, provides clear evidence of the conservative nature of Ossetian linguistic development. The Digor dialect, spoken by roughly 100,000 people in the western regions of North Ossetia, exhibits even more archaic features that reflect earlier stages of Alan linguistic development. The retention of ancient Iranian consonant clusters that were simplified in other Eastern Iranian languages, along with verbal conjugation patterns that mirror those found in ancient Scythian inscriptions, demonstrates the remarkable linguistic conservatism that characterized isolated mountain communities during the post-medieval period. The vocabulary of both dialects contains extensive terminology related to traditional pastoral activities, metalworking and mountain warfare that provides direct links to the material culture described in medieval sources about Alan society. The geographic distribution of Ossetian-speaking populations reflects the settlement patterns established during the medieval period and consolidated during the centuries following Mongol conquest. The central valleys of North Ossetia, including the Terek, Fyagdon and Jizil valleys, contain the densest concentrations of Ossetian speakers and the most conservative linguistic forms. These areas correspond closely to the territories that served as refuge zones during the 13th century displacement period, suggesting continuous occupation by Alan descendants throughout the intervening centuries. The village names in these valleys frequently preserve Alan etymologies that can be traced through medieval Georgian and Armenian sources, providing additional evidence for demographic continuity. The establishment of South Ossetia as a distinct regional entity occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries as Ossetian communities expanded southward across the main Caucasus ridge into territories that had been depopulated by earlier conflicts between Georgian kingdoms and Ottoman forces. The migration of approximately 15,000 Ossetians into the Shida-Kartli region during this period created the demographic foundation for what would eventually become the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast under Soviet administration. These southern settlements maintained close cultural and linguistic ties with their northern relatives while developing distinct dialectical features influenced by contact with Georgian linguistic and cultural traditions. The preservation of traditional epic poetry among Ossetian communities provided crucial cultural continuity that maintained historical memory and ethnic identity throughout centuries of political subordination and cultural pressure. The Naat sagas, which represent the most complete surviving corpus of ancient steppe heroic literature, preserve narrative traditions that can be traced directly to medieval Alan oral poetry. These epic cycles, performed by professional storytellers called kadjite, contain detailed descriptions of ancient customs, religious practices, and social structures that correspond closely to archaeological evidence from Alan settlement sites. The central heroes of these sagas, Soslan, Batrats, and Uruzmag, embody warrior ideals and moral concepts that reflect the value systems of medieval Alan society. The religious practices that sustained Ossetian cultural identity combined elements of ancient Iranian traditions with Christian beliefs and local Caucasian spiritual concepts in ways that created distinctive syncretic systems. The traditional Ossetian pantheon, headed by the supreme deity Kutsau, incorporates ancient Iranian divine concepts alongside Christian saints and local mountain spirits. The annual festivals that mark important seasonal transitions, particularly the spring celebration of Kayek Gaini and the autumn feast of Jorghoibe, preserve ritual elements that can be traced to pre-Christian Iranian religious practices while incorporating Christian symbolism and Georgian Orthodox influences. The archaeological investigations that began during the Soviet period and have continued under Russian and international auspices have provided extensive material evidence for the continuity between medieval Alan culture and modern Ossetian traditions. The excavations at Verkhny Djulat, conducted between 1967 and 1985, revealed stratified occupation layers extending from the 8th century through the 15th century, demonstrating continuous habitation despite the disruptions of Mongol conquest. The material culture recovered from these layers shows clear evolutionary development from medieval Alan artifacts to Proto-Ossetian forms, with pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and architectural elements displaying gradual modification rather than abrupt replacement. The cemetery excavations at Zmayskaya and other Ossetian village sites have revealed burial practices that maintain clear connections to medieval Alan traditions, while incorporating new elements adapted to Christian requirements and local environmental conditions. The orientation of graves, the types of grave goods included with burials, and the construction techniques used for burial chambers all demonstrate continuity with earlier Alan practices, while showing gradual adaptation to changed religious and social circumstances. The weapons and personal ornaments found in these burials frequently display decorative motifs that can be traced through centuries of artistic development from medieval Alan prototypes to modern Ossetian folk art traditions. The scholarly recognition of the Alan-Ossetian connection began during the 19th century as European linguists and ethnographers identified the Iranian character of the Ossetian language and recognized its relationship to historical sources describing the medieval Alans. The pioneering work of scholars like Andreas Sjogren and Vsevolod Miller established the linguistic foundations for understanding Ossetian as a direct descendant of the Alan language. while archaeological investigations by Vladimir Kuznetsov and other Soviet scholars provided material evidence supporting these linguistic connections. The comprehensive studies conducted during the 20th century by scholars such as Vasily Abayev created detailed reconstructions of Allan-Ossetian linguistic and cultural development that demonstrated the remarkable continuity of this tradition. The development of written Ossetian literature during the 19th and 20th centuries provided new venues for cultural expression while preserving traditional oral traditions in permanent form. The first Ossetian alphabet, created by Andreas Sjögren in 1844, used Cyrillic characters adapted to represent the distinctive sounds of the Ossetian language. The literary works produced by early Ossetian writers like Kosta Kitagurov incorporated traditional epic themes and folk motifs while addressing contemporary social and political issues affecting Ossetian communities. The establishment of Ossetian language education and publishing during the Soviet period enabled the systematic preservation of oral traditions while creating new forms of cultural expression adapted to modern circumstances. The political organization of Ossetian territories during the Imperial Russian and Soviet period reflected the complex ethnic and administrative challenges posed by governing mountain populations with distinct cultural traditions and historical grievances. The creation of the Tersky Oblast in 1860 brought Ossetian communities under direct Russian administration for the first time, requiring the development of new governmental structures that could accommodate traditional clan-based social organization within the framework of imperial bureaucracy. The subsequent establishment of the Mountain Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1921, followed by the creation of separate North Ossetian and South Ossetian autonomous regions, provided formal recognition of Ossetian ethnic identity while integrating these territories into larger political structures. The impact of Soviet modernization policies on traditional Ossetian culture created both opportunities for cultural development and challenges to traditional practices that had sustained ethnic identity for centuries. The collectivization of agriculture during the 1930s disrupted traditional pastoral practices and clan-based land tenure systems while providing access to modern agricultural techniques and equipment that improved living standards. The industrialization programs that established manufacturing facilities in Vladikavkaz and other Ossetian urban centers created new economic opportunities while drawing population away from traditional mountain communities where cultural preservation was strongest. The educational policies implemented during the Soviet period had profound effects on Ossetian cultural development, as universal literacy programs conducted in the Ossetian language enabled broader participation in literary culture while standardizing linguistic forms that had previously varied significantly between different communities. The establishment of the North Ossetian State University in 1920 created institutional support for scholarly research on Ossetian history and culture, while training teachers and cultural workers who could preserve and transmit traditional knowledge to younger generations. The publication of Ossetian language textbooks, literature, and scholarly works during this period created a substantial body of written material that supplemented traditional oral culture. The challenges faced by Ossetian communities during the post-Soviet period have tested the resilience of cultural traditions while creating new opportunities for ethnic self-expression and political autonomy. The conflicts that affected South Ossetia during the 1990s and 2008 highlighted the continued importance of ethnic identity in regional politics, while demonstrating the strength of cultural bonds that connect Ossetian communities across political boundaries. The international recognition of South Ossetian independence by Russia and several other countries in 2008 represented a significant milestone in the political development of Ossetian national identity, though this recognition remains disputed by much of the international community. The contemporary cultural revival movements within Ossetian communities have emphasized the preservation and promotion of traditional practices, while adapting these traditions to modern circumstances and global cultural influences. The annual World Congress of the Ossetian People, first convened in 1994, provides a forum for cultural exchange and political coordination between Ossetian communities in North Ossetia, South Ossetia, and diaspora populations in other regions. These gatherings typically feature performances of traditional music and dance, competitions in traditional sports like horseback riding and marksmanship, and scholarly presentations on Ossetian history and culture that maintain connections to the ancient Alan heritage. The linguistic preservation efforts undertaken by contemporary Ossetian cultural organisations have focused on documenting dialectical variations and traditional vocabulary that might otherwise be lost due to urbanisation and cultural assimilation pressures. The comprehensive dictionaries and grammatical studies produced during recent decades have created detailed records of Ossetian linguistic traditions, while providing resources for language education programs in schools and universities. The development of Ossetian language media, including television programming, internet content, and social media platforms, has created new venues for cultural expression while reaching younger generations who might otherwise have limited exposure to traditional culture. The archaeological research conducted in recent decades has continued to expand understanding of the historical connections between ancient Alan culture and modern Ossetian traditions. The excavations at Brut Dargavs and other medieval sites have revealed additional evidence for the continuity of settlement patterns, architectural traditions, and material culture that links contemporary Ossetian communities to their medieval Alan ancestors. The application of modern scientific techniques, including radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, and isotope studies, has provided new types of evidence that support traditional historical narratives, while revealing previously unknown aspects of ancient Alan society and migration patterns. The genetic studies conducted on modern Ossetian populations have provided biological evidence for the historical connections claimed by traditional oral histories and linguistic analysis. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA patterns found in Ossetian populations show clear relationships to ancient Iranian populations, while displaying the effects of centuries of interaction with Caucasian and Slavic neighbours. These genetic signatures correspond closely to the migration patterns and settlement histories described in medieval sources, providing independent confirmation of the historical narratives preserved in Ossetian oral traditions. The cultural significance of the Alan heritage in contemporary Ossetian identity extends far beyond academic historical interest to encompass fundamental questions of ethnic identity, political legitimacy, and cultural continuity in the modern world. The symbols and narratives drawn from Alan history appear prominently in Ossetian national emblems, political rhetoric, and cultural celebrations that reinforce connections to this ancient heritage. The medieval fortress of Magas has been reconstructed as a symbol of Ossetian historical continuity, while traditional Alan military equipment and artistic motifs appear frequently in contemporary Ossetian cultural productions. The international scholarly recognition of the Alan-Ossetian connection has contributed to broader understanding of medieval European history, while highlighting the importance of the Caucasus region as a bridge between European and Asian civilizations. The research conducted by international teams of archaeologists, linguists, and historians has established the Alans as crucial participants in the great migrations that reshaped medieval Europe, while demonstrating the remarkable cultural continuity that enabled their descendants to preserve essential elements of their identity through centuries of political upheaval and cultural pressure. The preservation of Alan-Ossetian cultural traditions in the modern world represents one of the most remarkable examples of ethnic continuity in European history, demonstrating how traditional societies can maintain essential elements of their identity while adapting to changing political and social circumstances. the Ossetian people, numbering approximately 700,000 individuals worldwide, continue to speak the language of their Alan ancestors, practice cultural traditions that can be traced to medieval sources, and maintain historical narratives that connect them directly to the warriors who once dominated the Eurasian steppes. This cultural continuity, preserved through centuries of conquest, displacement, and modernization, stands as a testament to the resilience of human cultural traditions and the enduring power of historical memory in shaping contemporary identity. The legacy of the Alans thus lives on not merely as a subject of historical study, but as a living tradition embodied in the Ossetian communities of the Caucasus Mountains. From their origins as Sarmatian warriors on the Pontic Steppes to their transformation into medieval Christian kingdoms, through the trauma of Mongol conquest and the gradual adaptation to mountain life, the Alan people have maintained an unbroken chain of cultural transmission that spans nearly 2 millennia. In the valleys where their ancestors once sought refuge from Hunnic expansion, modern Ossetians continue to speak an ancient Iranian language, preserve epic traditions that echo with the voices of medieval bards, and maintain cultural practices that connect them directly to the nomadic warriors who once struck fear into the hearts of Roman legions and Byzantine emperors. The story of the Alans, therefore, is not merely a tale of ancient conquest and medieval kingdoms, but a continuing narrative of cultural survival and adaptation that demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human societies to preserve their essential identity across the vast expanses of historical time.